Before we start, make sure you're warm, safe, and settled. No need to stay awake. This is your permission to doze off. And if you feel like these videos are of any use to you, then you can like and subscribe, but only if you really feel like it. And now, let's begin. If you ever thought ancient Egyptian weddings were a grand spectacle of love, think again. More often than not, these unions were less about Cupid and more about contracts, with a hefty dose of family negotiations thrown into the mix. Picture a bustling market, but instead of fruits and spices, it's sons and daughters up for negotiation. We're diving into the world of ancient Egypt from 3000 to 30 BCE, a time when a wedding wasn't just a personal affair, but a strategic alliance. You see, in a society where the Nile's flooding was more predictable than love, marriages were primarily about securing economic stability and social status. Let's set the stage. Egypt was not just the land of pharaohs and pyramids. It was a complex society with a layered social hierarchy. At the top sat the pharaoh, a living deity, and below him a cascading order of officials, priests, and labourers. Now, if you were an average Egyptian, say a farmer working the fertile Nile Delta, your wedding wasn't going to resemble a Hollywood rom-com. The concept of a lavish ceremony complete with a 10-tier cake and a live band was as foreign as a smartphone to a crocodile god. Instead, these were practical affairs, often sealed with nothing more than a handshake and a transfer of goods. The dowries and property transactions. This is where the magic, or should I say the haggling, happened. A marriage was as much about merging real estate as it was about uniting hearts. The dowry, a gift from the bride's family to the groom, was essentially the ancient version of a savings account. It could include land, livestock, or even household goods, the ancient Egyptian starter pack for a newlywed couple. According to some records, a dowry could be as modest as a few goats or as grand as several acres of fertile land. Talk about putting all your assets in the Nile basket. But before you think this was just a transaction of cattle and clay pots, let's add a splash of romance, or at least the closest equivalent. While the ancient Egyptians didn't write long love letters, they did have love poetry that rivaled Shakespeare in passion. Yet, for most, the fluttering heartbeats were secondary to ensuring the family farm was in safe hands. Now, let's tackle a popular myth head-on, the idea that ancient weddings were grand ceremonies with all the pomp and circumstance of Cleopatra inviting Mark Antony to a soiree. The reality? Much more low-key. Most weddings were private affairs, typically without any formal ceremony. There was no priest presiding over vows, no crowd of onlookers throwing papyrus confetti. Instead, it was a family affair, sometimes just a simple agreement between the couple and their parents, possibly celebrated with a modest feast if the granaries were full. But don't dismiss the Egyptians as entirely unromantic. There was certainly affection involved, just not the kind you'd find in a Nicholas Sparks novel. The practicalities of marriage often overshadowed tender sentiments, but there are records of couples expressing genuine fondness for each other. In a society where life was as fragile as a reed boat in a tempest, companionship was valued, even if it started with a barter rather than a bouquet. So, what about the social parameters? Marriage was a significant social contract, heavily influenced by one's standing. For the elite, marriage was a means of consolidating power and wealth. If you were a noble, marrying off your daughter to another influential family was akin to securing an alliance more Game of Thrones than The Notebook. Meanwhile, common folk had simpler concerns, like ensuring there were enough hands to till the fields and mouths to continue the family line. And here's a kicker. Divorce was actually an option. Unlike some societies where marriage was a life sentence, ancient Egyptians could part ways if things went south. A simple agreement between both parties could dissolve the marriage, and the dowry was often returned to the wife. Talk about a fair exit strategy. In essence, ancient Egyptian weddings were a blend of economics, social strategy, and a pinch of sentimentality. They were no grand theatre productions, but they played a critical role in shaping the social fabric of one of history's most fascinating civilizations. So next time you hear about a wedding that costs as much as a small island, remember the Egyptians, masters of practicality, who knew that a solid marriage could be built on more than just a lavish ceremony. Let's jump back into the Nile waters, where wedding preparations in ancient Egypt were less about heartstrings and more about purse strings. Now, If you thought planning a modern wedding was a headache, imagine overseeing an ancient Egyptian union where the negotiations could make a Wall Street deal look like child's play. The families were the main players here, and they weren't just picking out flower arrangements or debating over chicken or fish for the reception. No, they were busy haggling over dowries and drawing up contracts that would make a lawyer's head spin. Dowries, those ancient bundles of joy or burden, depending on your perspective, were a crucial part of the matrimonial equation. We're not talking about a paltry sum or a token gesture here. Dowries were the financial backbone of the marriage contract, more like a starter kit for the couple's life together. These packages could range from a few goats to whole plots of land, depending on the family's wealth and social standing. For example, in one recorded case, a farmer's daughter might bring a couple of donkeys into the marriage, while a noble's daughter could enter wedded bliss with a small estate. Talk about a his and hers property package. But before we get too starry-eyed over the idea of a nice little plot by the Nile, let's remember the real motivation behind these transactions: social standing. The dowry wasn't just about securing the couple's future, it was about elevating the family's status. A well-endowed dowry could catapult a family up the social ladder faster than a pharaoh could say, pyramid scheme. This was the age-old game of social chess, and everyone was a player. Contracts were as central to marriage as the rings are today, and they were no joke. These legal documents spelled out everything from the dowry details to the couple's responsibilities. Forget for richer or poorer, the contract was all about the nitty-gritty of who gets what and who owes what should things go south. And these weren't just verbal agreements. Written records, often on papyrus, were the norm, leaving behind a paper trail that would keep ancient divorce lawyers busy. Negotiating these contracts was an art form, a delicate dance of give and take, or, more accurately, take and take some more. The families would often call in scribes to document the proceedings, ensuring that every goat and grain was accounted for. In this world, a misstep in negotiations could mean social disaster. So, everyone treated carefully, balancing the scales of economy and prestige. Now, let's add a pinch of drama to this already spicy mix. Imagine the scene: two families at a table, each with their own scribe, quibbling over the value of a plot of land or the worth of a prized cow. One anecdote tells of a particularly heated negotiation where the bride's family insisted on including a rare breed of cattle in the dowry, only to have the groom's family counter with a demand for additional land. The back and forth went on for days, with the scribes feverishly scribbling down each twist and turn. Eventually, they settled on a compromise that left both sides satisfied and the couple with a healthy start to their new life. Modern prenups have nothing on these ancient tug-o-wars. With all this focus on assets and alliances, you might wonder if love ever entered the picture. Well, it did, but more as a subplot than the main story. Romance, while not entirely absent, was often overshadowed by practicality. The family was the cornerstone of Egyptian society, and marriage was its mortar. Strengthening bonds between clans was the ultimate goal, and any affection between the couple was a bonus, a happy coincidence rather than a driving force. And speaking of alliances, these marriages were ripe for political maneuvering. For the upper echelons, a marriage could mean the difference between maintaining power and watching it slip away like sand through their fingers. A strategic union could consolidate wealth, secure military alliances, or even ensure a stable succession. The stakes were high, and everyone knew it. Hence the meticulous attention to every detail in the marriage contract. In essence, weddings in ancient Egypt were an intricate tapestry of economics, social strategy, and a hint of sentimentality. The families orchestrated these unions with the precision of an architect planning a grand monument. Sure, there might have been some fluttering hearts along the way, but let's not kid ourselves. Most of that fluttering was due to the clinking of coins and the shuffling of papyrus. The result was a society where marriages fortified the social fabric, intertwining the fates of families as securely as the bricks of a pyramid. And isn't that a legacy worth celebrating, even if it began with a contract rather than a courtship? As we roll out the papyrus carpet on the actual wedding day, let's dive into the scene. It's a mix of religious rites, communal festivities, and, let's be honest, a sprinkle of divine intervention for good measure. Imagine a day less about champagne toasts, and more about invoking the gods, because in ancient Egypt, the deities didn't just RSVP to your wedding, they were practically on the guest list. The Egyptians had a pantheon of gods that could make even the most seasoned wedding planner break a sweat. From Hathor, the goddess of love and music, to Amun, the king of the gods, the stakes were high to keep them all happy. You see, the ancient Egyptians didn't just throw a party, they sought celestial blessings for a prosperous union. Priests, who were the rock stars of religious rituals, played a pivotal role in this celestial networking event. They were the intermediaries, the ones who could whisper a word in a god's ear and ensure your marriage got off to a divine start. Forget about a DJ. These ceremonies often kicked off with hymns and offerings to the gods, ensuring that the couple had spiritual backing as robust as their dowry agreement. Religious rites were not merely symbolic, they were practical. At a time when life was as unpredictable as the Nile's flood cycles, divine favour was a prerequisite. A typical ceremony might involve offerings of bread, beer, and incense, a combo that sounds like the makings of a hipster brunch rather than a sacred ritual. But for the Egyptians, these were essential gifts to the gods, a way of saying thank you in advance for a harmonious marriage. It wasn't about wooing the crowd, it was about wooing the divine. Moving on from the sacred to the social, let's talk guest lists. Sorry to burst your bubble, but the idea of a wedding with hundreds of guests and a buffet that could rival a royal feast is more myth than reality. The average Egyptian wedding was more modest than you might imagine. The guest list was typically limited to close family and friends. Think more intimate dinner party than royal banquet. And the food? Far from the opulent spreads depicted in Hollywood, the fare was simple, practical, and locally sourced long before it was trendy. Bread, beer, vegetables, and perhaps some meat if the family was feeling particularly generous. Now, before you start imagining a drab affair, remember that Egyptians knew how to have a good time without breaking the bank. These celebrations might not have been extravagant, but they were lively. Music and dance were essential parts of the festivities, with instruments like harps, flutes, and drums setting the rhythm for the day's events. Picture an impromptu concert rather than a choreographed wedding dance, with guests joining in and contributing to the celebratory atmosphere. The practicalities of the day extended to clothing as well. Forget about elaborate gowns and tuxedos. Brides and grooms typically donned their best everyday attire. White linen being a popular choice due to its symbolism of purity and its ability to keep you cool in the sweltering Egyptian heat. Jewelry was a must, of course, but it was more about personal significance than ostentatious displays of wealth. Amulets and charms often adorned the couple, each piece carrying its own meaning and blessing. And let's not overlook the role of beer. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a staple, a liquid bread, if you will. It served as both a drink and a form of currency, and on wedding days it flowed as freely as the Nile during flood season. Guests would toast to the couple's future, their mugs filled with the frothy brew, which, let's face it, probably contributed to the celebratory and occasionally raucous atmosphere. But while the day was filled with communal cheer, it was also a reminder of the practical alliances being forged. Families were not just celebrating love, they were cementing partnerships. The conversations weren't about honeymoon destinations, but about shared responsibilities and the future of both households. This pragmatic approach to marriage might seem cold, but it was the bedrock of Egyptian society. It was about ensuring stability in a world where life was as transient as the sands of the desert. Now, if you're picturing a day devoid of romance, think again. There was affection, though it was often tucked behind a veil of practicality. The couple might exchange gifts, tokens of their commitment, and symbols of their new life together. These could range from simple trinkets to more substantial offerings depending on the couple's means. It was a gesture of goodwill and a nod to the personal bond forming within the framework of a larger social contract. So, as the sun set over the Nile, casting its golden hues over the festivities, the day would wind down. The families, now bound together, would look forward to a future that promised not just personal happiness, but communal prosperity. And while the couple might not have ridden off into the sunset on a white horse, they faced their future with the backing of their gods, their families, and a society that valued unity over opulence. In the grand scheme of ancient Egyptian life, weddings were less about the individual love story and more about the societal tapestry. They were a microcosm of the civilization itself, practical, strategic, and deeply rooted in both the earthly and the divine. So, while modern weddings might aim for spectacle, the Egyptians knew that the true strength of the marriage lay not in its ceremony, but in its ability to withstand the shifting sands of time. And that, my friends, is a legacy that transcends both time and Nile waters. As the newlyweds stepped away from the final strains of harp music and the echo of clinking beer mugs, a whole new chapter loomed ahead, because, let's be honest, the real adventure begins after the guests leave. In ancient Egypt, marriage wasn't just a change of address or a reason to update your Facebook status. It was a complete overhaul of your daily life. Now, if you think modern couples have it tough, balancing Netflix subscriptions, try managing a household in a society where even the Nile had a mind of its own. First up, let's dissect the roles within the marriage, because, spoiler alert, ancient Egyptian society had its own set of expectations. Men were typically the breadwinners, working as farmers, craftsmen, or scribes, depending on their social status. Meanwhile, women were the CEOs of the household, overseeing everything from food storage to textile production. Forget about arguing over who does the dishes. These roles were as clear-cut as the hieroglyphs on a temple wall. But here's a twist. Ancient Egyptian women had more economic clout than you might expect. In fact, they could own property, run businesses, and even initiate divorce. Cue the raised eyebrows of surprise. This level of autonomy was practically unheard of in many other ancient societies. So while women might have been running the home, they also had the keys to the family treasure chest. Talk about a power couple dynamic. And let's not forget the economic pressures that came hand in hand with marriage. If you thought modern wedding bills were brutal, imagine the ongoing costs of maintaining a household in ancient times. For most families, life revolved around agriculture, with the fertile lands of the Nile Delta offering both bounty and challenge. The newlyweds would have to navigate the unpredictable Nile floods, which could either bless their fields with nutrient-rich silt or sweep away their hard-earned crops like a pharaoh's tax collector on steroids. This brings us to the concept of family labor, a euphemistic way of saying everyone had to pull their weight. Children weren't just adorable mini-me's, they were essential workforce members. From a young age, kids contributed to the family's livelihood, whether it was by helping in the fields, tending to livestock, or learning the family trade. So, if you're a parent today struggling to get your teenager to take out the trash, spare a thought for the ancient Egyptians who had little ones learning the ropes of survival from day one. But why all this emphasis on labor and economics? Well, dear listeners, it all ties back to the societal expectation of marriage as a means of securing not just personal happiness, but also economic stability. Inheritance played a key role here. Properties and possessions were typically passed down through the family line, often determined by complex legal documents that rivaled modern tax codes in complexity. Ensuring a smooth transfer of assets was crucial, not just for personal gain, but for the stability of the community as a whole. Now, let's sprinkle in some humor by comparing ancient marital advice to modern relationship tips. Today, we're inundated with self-help books and marriage counselors encouraging couples to communicate openly and share responsibilities. Back then, advice might have been a bit more pragmatic. Ensure your granary is full before the Nile floods, or marry someone who knows their way around a papyrus contract. But beneath these practical tips lay timeless truths, nurturing a partnership, balancing responsibilities, and maintaining mutual respect were as crucial in ancient times as they are today. And while we're dispelling myths, let's tackle the notion of everlasting bliss. Ancient Egyptian marriages, like any, had their ups and downs. Infidelity, although less documented, certainly occurred, and societal pressures to maintain family honor could weigh heavily on a couple. Divorce, while possible, was not a decision taken lightly. It required a formal agreement, often with community witnesses and economic repercussions that could ripple through families like a pebble in the Nile. So, what about the love story amid this sea of practicality? Did any couples manage to find romance in their union? Of course. Love poems and inscriptions reveal tender affections between spouses, even if these declarations were often woven into the fabric of duty and responsibility. One notable papyrus, for example, includes a husband writing to his wife, praising her beauty and kindness, proof that even in a world governed by contracts and crops, the heart had its own agenda. As we conclude this chapter of the newlyweds' journey, let's remember that the essence of marriage in ancient Egypt was about more than just the two individuals at its center. It was an institution that bound families, reinforced social structures, and ensured the continuity of community life. And while our modern eyes might see these unions through a lens of practicality, there's an undeniable beauty in the way they wove love and duty into a tapestry as enduring as the pyramids. So, as the ancient couple settled into their new life, juggling roles, responsibilities, and the occasional romantic gesture, they weren't just building a life, they were constructing a legacy. And in a society where the line between the personal and the communal was as blurred as a hieroglyph in a sandstorm, that legacy was as vital as the life-giving waters of the Nile itself. But hold on to your papyrus, because there's more to explore in this ancient marital saga. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the pressures and pleasures of married life in the land of the pharaohs. So here we are, standing on the banks of the Nile with a newlywed couple who have just embarked on the great adventure of marriage. But let's not get too misty-eyed, because, let's face it, the real test wasn't the wedding itself, but the countless days that followed, where romance often had to elbow its way past a mountain of mundane chores and societal expectations. Ancient Egyptian marriages, much like today, demanded a blend of compromise, partnership, and, occasionally, a really good sense of humour. Let's start by examining the legacy of these ancient unions and the ripple effects they had on future cultures. Ancient Egyptian marriage customs were not just a flash in the historical pan. They left an indelible mark on the sands of time, influencing both the Greeks and Romans. The Romans, for instance, adopted the concept of the dowry, an idea that stuck like glue and made its way into European matrimonial practices. If only they had also adopted the Egyptians' pragmatic view on divorce. Think of the legal fees we could have saved. Speaking of which, the ancient Egyptians' relatively progressive approach to divorce was quite the trendsetter. While not exactly a no-fault divorce in today's terms, it was a straightforward process compared to the labyrinthine legalities of later European practices. Couples could split, agree on the division of property, and move on. It's almost like they were advocating for a clean break long before Gwyneth Paltrow and her conscious uncoupling made headlines. But let's not kid ourselves. These marriages were not about wedding hashtags or curated Instagram moments. They were about survival. The Nile might have been the lifeblood of Egyptian society, but it was marriage that ensured the continuity of that society. It was both a personal contract and a societal duty, stretching its implications far beyond the couple's own household. The success of a marriage could stabilize a family's economic status, cement alliances, and even shape political landscapes. Imagine that, your marriage influencing not just your dinner menu but your entire community's future. Now, let's flip the script and see how these ancient practices challenge our modern perceptions of marriage. Today we often view marriage through a romantic lens, with love as the ultimate goal. But the Egyptians remind us that marriage has always been a multifaceted institution. Sure, love is a fantastic ingredient, but it's not the whole recipe. Economic stability, social cohesion, and familial alliances played a significant role in ancient unions, and, let's be honest, they still do today, whether we like to admit it or not. In fact, one could argue that our modern emphasis on romance might benefit from a little ancient pragmatism. The Egyptians understood something timeless, that marriage is as much about partnership and practicality as it is about passion. It's about building a life together that can weather both the gentle breeze and the stormy Nile floods. And while we might not barter with goats and grain anymore, the essence of compromise, mutual respect, and shared goals remains unchanged. So, what really makes a marriage work, then and now? Is it the starry-eyed declarations of eternal love, the carefully planned ceremonies, or the glittering rings? Or is it something more enduring, something that the ancient Egyptians knew all too well? Perhaps it's the understanding that marriage is not just a union of two individuals, but a partnership that requires effort, negotiation, and yes, a fair bit of patience. As we wrap up our journey through the swirling sands of ancient Egyptian weddings, let's carry forward this nugget of wisdom while love adds the sparkle. It's the shared responsibilities and the ability to adapt to life's unpredictable currents that form the bedrock of a lasting marriage. And isn't that a legacy worth embracing, whether you're navigating the ancient waters of the Nile or the modern bustle of city life? In the end, the story of ancient Egyptian marriages is a testament to the resilience of human relationships. They were complex, strategic, and sometimes messy, but they were also a cornerstone of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. So next time you find yourself at a wedding, toasting to the happy couple, remember the Egyptians, masters of practicality and pioneers of partnership, who knew that the true measure of a marriage wasn't in the ceremony, but in the shared journey that followed. And with that, we leave our ancient couple to their life along the Nile, knowing that their legacy continues to flow through the river of time, much like the mighty Nile itself. Cheers to them, and to all of us navigating the ever-changing tides of love and partnership. In the sun-drenched chaos of late 18th century Saint-Domingue, where sugar was king and the whip its loyal servant, young Toussaint Louverture was born into the kind of paradox that only history can conjure. Here's a place that was making more money than the entire United States. Yeah, let that sink in. But at the same time, it was a bubbling cauldron of human suffering. The island was a cash cow, sure, but one fed on the backs of the enslaved. And in the midst of this economic juggernaut, our hero Louverture was born free, a rarity in a world where freedom was a luxury fewer than 10% of black people could claim. Louverture came into the world on the Breda plantation, a slice of land roughly the size of a large parking lot in modern terms, but a sprawling estate in the colonial context. This was a time and place where life was cheap, but sugar was not. Saint-Domingue was cranking out 40% of the world's sugar and more than half of its coffee. So while the land was sweet, living there was anything but. Yet somehow Toussaint managed to navigate this sugar-coated labyrinth with a surprising amount of savvy, starting with his early days under the uncertain shade of the plantation's towering cane fields. Now, you might wonder how Toussaint ended up free in a society where freedom was as scarce as a snowstorm in July. The story goes that his father, Guineau, was a captured African prince, because every hero needs a noble backstory, right? More likely, it was a mix of luck, his parents' status, and perhaps even some strategic decisions by the plantation owners, who saw value in having a free black overseer. Whatever the true reason, the result was the same. Toussaint was not shackled to the grind of plantation labor, a twist of fate that would have cataclysmic implications for the future of the island. Speaking of twists, let's talk about the Jesuits. These guys were like the intellectual ninjas of the Catholic Church, and they had a mission in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint got his education from them, and they must have seen something special in him. I mean, the Jesuits didn't hand out knowledge like candy. You had to earn it. For Toussaint, this education was a key that unlocked his potential, allowing him to read, write, and strategize in ways that most of his contemporaries could only dream of. He was like the ultimate Renaissance man in a world still stuck in the Dark Ages. The Jesuits, being the practical sort, were also deeply involved in the economic life of the colony. They knew the plantation system inside and out, and their teachings likely gave Toussaint a front-row seat to the economic theatre of Saint-Domingue. The island was a giant money machine, and its gears were greased with the sweat and blood of enslaved labourers. The irony is rich. Here's Toussaint, a free man learning about the system that enslaved his people, poised to one day turn it on its head. The economic backdrop of Saint-Domingue was nothing short of staggering. The island was a veritable gold mine, producing wealth at such a breakneck speed that the French crown couldn't help but drool over its potential. It's estimated that the colony was responsible for 2/3 of France's overseas trade. But this wealth came with a dark underbelly, an enslaved population that outnumbered the free by more than 10-1. It was a powder keg of inequality, and young Toussaint, with his Jesuit education and free status, was unwittingly gathering the matches. As Toussaint grew, so did the tensions on the island. The economic boom was built on an unsustainable and brutal system, and while the plantation owners were getting fat off sugar and coffee, the enslaved were getting, well, just fatally overworked. Yet, Toussaint observed, he learned. He absorbed the contradictions of his world freedom in a land of chains, education in a culture of ignorance, and peace in a time of unrest. These contradictions would forge the man who would later be known not just as a revolutionary, but as a tactician and a leader who could see beyond the immediate to the possible. Let's not put the cart before the horse, though. Toussaint's early life was less about heroics and more about navigation. Navigating the social hierarchies, the economic disparities, and the political tensions of a colony on the brink. He was a man out of place, yet perfectly positioned to make a difference. a free black man in a colonized world. He was both an insider and an outsider, a product of his environment, but also a force against it. His life was a delicate dance on the edge of a volcano, and it was only a matter of time before the ground beneath him would rumble and challenge him to leap. In the end, Toussaint Louverture's early life was like the overture to a dramatic symphony, a prelude filled with the themes and motifs that would define his later years. He was a man of his time, yet ahead of it, someone who saw the cracks in the facade of colonial power and knew, deep down, that they could be widened. His story reminds us that history is not just a series of events, but a complex web of choices and consequences, where even the smallest twist of fate can change the course of nations. And as we delve deeper into his life, we'll see how this man from a small island would come to challenge empires and rewrite the rules of power. But for now, let's leave young Toussaint under the Caribbean sun, soaking up knowledge and biding his time, waiting for the moment when history would call him to action. As Toussaint soaked up the Caribbean sun, the island around him was starting to boil over. By 1791, Saint-Domingue was a simmering stew of discontent, and the enslaved population was about to turn up the heat. Picture it, a tropical paradise that's more like a pressure cooker, where the enslaved, outnumbering the free 10-1, decided they were done being the secret ingredient in France's economic soufflé. This was the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, a revolt that would eventually become the first and only successful slave-led revolution in history. And while the idea of freedom was as sweet as the sugar they harvested, the path to it was going to be anything but smooth. Now, you might expect a fiery upstart like Toussaint to jump headfirst into the fray, sword in hand, but our man was initially a bit of a reluctant revolutionary. Why, you ask? Well, for starters, Toussaint was a free man with a family, a rare breed on an island where freedom was as common as a unicorn sighting. He had something to lose, and revolutions tend to be messy affairs with a high risk of, well, losing your head, literally and metaphorically. But the revolution wasn't waiting for anyone's hesitation. It erupted in August 1791, fueled by the brutal realities of plantation life and the intoxicating whispers of liberté, égalité, fraternité wafting across the Atlantic from revolutionary France. The enslaved population, armed with little more than machetes and sheer determination, rose up in a wave of fiery rebellion. Plantations burned, and the colonial order began to crumble under the weight of its own cruelty. Amidst the chaos, Toussaint was watching closely. He was like a chess player, studying the board, weighing his moves. Joining the revolt wasn't just a leap of faith, it was a strategic decision. And strategy was where Toussaint truly shone. By 1793, he had thrown his lot in with the revolutionaries. But here's the kicker. Toussaint didn't just join the fight, he transformed it. With his military acumen that seemed almost preordained, he quickly rose through the ranks, proving that he was not just another face in the crowd, but a leader destined to reshape the fate of the island. Toussaint's strategic genius lay in his ability to forge alliances, even with the most unlikely of partners. Take, for instance, his initial alliance with the Spanish. Yes, the same Spain that had an eye on the island's lush resources. It was a classic case of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Spanish, like savvy opportunists, were all too willing to support any effort that would undermine the French. And Toussaint, ever the pragmatist, knew that aligning with them could provide the arms and support needed to keep the revolution alive. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the French Revolution was unfolding with all the grace of a storm at sea. Heads were rolling faster than you could say guillotine, and France's attention was divided between keeping its own revolution afloat and dealing with the colonial uprisings in Saint-Domingue. For Toussaint, this was both a blessing and a curse. The chaos in France meant less immediate pressure from the colonial government, but it also meant that the winds of political change were unpredictable at best. In the midst of this turmoil, Toussaint's leadership style began to shine. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was playing a high-stakes game of diplomacy. He managed to win over not just the enslaved population, but also many of the island's free people of color, who had their own set of grievances against the colonial regime. It was a coalition of the willing united in their desire to break the chains of oppression, even if their visions for the future weren't always perfectly aligned. But let's not sugarcoat it too much. The revolution was brutal, the fighting fierce, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Toussaint had to navigate a landscape of shifting allegiances, betrayals, and the ever-present threat of retribution from the colonial powers. The island was a chessboard, and Toussaint was playing multiple games at once, each move calculated to outmaneuver his opponents and secure a future for his people. Yet the revolution wasn't just a military endeavour, it was also an economic one. Saint-Domingue's economy, built on the backs of the enslaved, was in tatters. The once prosperous plantations were now battlegrounds, and the sugar and coffee that had flowed so freely were now precious commodities. Toussaint understood that the revolution needed not just to win the war, but also to rebuild the economy in a way that didn't repeat the mistakes of the past. As the revolution gained traction, Toussaint's reputation grew. He was no longer just a leader of a rebellion, he was becoming a symbol of hope, a beacon of possibility in a world that seemed stacked against him. His story was one of transformation, not just of himself, but of an entire nation. And while the road ahead was fraught with challenges, Toussaint Louverture had already proven that he was more than capable of meeting them head-on. In the grand tapestry of history, Toussaint's rise was like a thread of defiance, weaving through the fabric of colonial power and oppression. His journey from reluctant participant to revolutionary leader was a testament to the power of strategy, vision, and unyielding determination. As the revolution continued to unfold, Toussaint stood at its helm, steering a course through the stormy seas of change, ready to face whatever came next with the same tenacity that had brought him this far. So, as we leave Toussaint at this pivotal moment, remember that the revolution was still in full swing and the story far from over. The battles were not just those fought with swords and muskets, but also those waged in the minds and hearts of the people, as they dared to imagine a future free from the chains of the past. And as history would soon reveal, Toussaint Louverture was just getting started. And so, with the revolution in full swing, Toussaint Louverture was just getting started. But it's not like he had a manual for how to build a nation after a revolution. What he did have was a keen eye for power dynamics and an uncanny ability to play the long game. Toussaint was about to embark on his most ambitious project yet, stabilizing a society that was like a jigsaw puzzle, where half the pieces were missing and the other half were on fire. First on his agenda, establishing himself as the de facto leader of Saint-Domingue. By 1796, he had already positioned himself as the head honcho of the revolutionary forces, a self-made general with a knack for turning chaos into order. But being the big cheese in a newly freed society wasn't just about military prowess, it was about politics, baby. Toussaint had to navigate a political minefield littered with European powers who were as trustworthy as a fox in a henhouse. Let's talk diplomacy. Toussaint was like the James Bond of the Caribbean, minus the tuxedo, but with a lot more at stake than a martini. He understood that if Saint-Domingue was going to survive, he needed to keep the European powers at bay while simultaneously playing them against each other. In 1798, he pulled off a diplomatic coup by negotiating the withdrawal of British forces from the island. The Brits had been meddling in Saint-Domingue's affairs like they were trying to win a colonial popularity contest, but Toussaint convinced them that leaving was in their best interest. How did he do it? By making it clear that the cost of staying outweighed any potential sugar-coated profits. But here's where things get a bit sticky. Toussaint's vision for a stable society was built on some rather controversial labour policies. You see, he had this little idea that the plantations needed to keep running to ensure the island's economic survival, but without, enslaving people. So, he introduced a system that was essentially a form of wage labour, but one that looked suspiciously like the old plantation system with a fresh coat of paint. Workers were required to stay on the land, and the plantation owners, now more like managers, had to pay them. Was it freedom? More like freedom adjacent. It was a pragmatic move to keep the economy afloat. But it also raised eyebrows and sparked debates about whether Toussaint was a liberator or just another plantation boss with a fancier title. Here's the twist. This approach worked, at least initially. The island's economy didn't just survive, it started to recover. Exports began to climb back up, and while sugar and coffee production never reached their pre-revolutionary heights, they were enough to keep the island's economic engine purring. But, and it's a big but, this came at the cost of Toussaint's popularity among those who had fought for freedom from the plantation system. It was like trading one set of chains for another, albeit less oppressive, set. The myth of Toussaint as a benevolent dictator starts to unravel here. Was he a visionary leader who understood the harsh economic realities, Or was he a boss with a really big plantation? It depends on who you ask. His labor policies were about as popular as a skunk at a garden party among those who expected a new world of freedom. Yet, to others, he was a man doing what he had to do to keep the island from falling into chaos. Now, if you think managing labor disputes was tough, try negotiating with Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ego could eclipse the sun. In 1801, Toussaint crafted a constitution for Saint-Domingue, declaring himself governor for life. This was a bold move, akin to poking a sleeping bear, and the bear was not amused. Napoleon, already juggling a few too many revolutionary balls, saw this as an affront to French authority. But Toussaint, ever the diplomat, framed it as a necessary step to stabilize the island. Whether Napoleon bought it or not is up for debate, but Toussaint's political finesse allowed him to maintain a delicate balance for a while. Toussaint's leadership style resembled a 19th century version of The Office, but with a lot more at stake than just quarterly sales. He was the boss who knew how to delegate, how to inspire loyalty, and how to make sure the sugar kept flowing. He was both a micromanager and a visionary, a paradox that made him as enigmatic as he was effective. So, where does this leave us? Toussaint Louverture was a man of contradictions, a leader whose actions could be seen as both pragmatic and problematic. He was a master of the tightrope, balancing the needs of a newly freed society with the harsh realities of a world that wasn't quite ready for what he was selling. And, as we leave him here, juggling diplomacy, labor policies, and the ever-present threat of French intervention, remember this, Toussaint's story is far from over. The revolution was still rumbling beneath the surface, and the next chapters would test his leadership in ways even he couldn't have anticipated. But for now, let's appreciate the audacity of a man who dared to dream big and the complexities of a revolution that was anything but black and white. As Toussaint stood on the brink of a new century, he was about to face a character who took the phrase short man syndrome to a whole new level. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, self-proclaimed emperor, and a guy who needed a ladder to reach the top shelf, yet had no problem reaching for global domination. Napoleon's ego was as vast as the empires he sought to conquer, and he had his sights set on reasserting French control over Saint-Domingue. Now, Toussaint's dance with diplomacy was about to turn into a full-blown tango with tension. His constitution of 1801 was a bold stroke, essentially declaring the island's autonomy while still paying lip service to French sovereignty. It was like telling your boss you're working remotely without actually asking for permission. The constitution named Toussaint governor for life, a title that made Napoleon see red. Oh, and it abolished slavery, which was a bit of a non-negotiable for the French economy that, let's be real, was as addicted to its colonial profits as a kid to sugar. Napoleon, juggling European wars like a circus act, didn't take kindly to this constitutional power grab. He was busy remaking France into his personal empire and didn't need a revolutionary governor stirring the pot in the Caribbean. For Napoleon, Toussaint's move was less about governance and more about an outright challenge. And if there's one thing Napoleon couldn't stand, it was someone else trying to take center stage. In classic Napoleonic fashion, he dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to Saint-Domingue with a fleet of 20,000 troops. That's right, 20,000 soldiers to subdue a single island. Talk about overkill. It's like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight. But Napoleon wasn't just flexing military muscle, he was signaling that the French grip on its colonies was far from slackening. Toussaint, ever the strategist, tried to play it cool. He welcomed Leclerc with the kind of hospitality that makes you wonder if he was secretly hoping they'd just sit down for tea and sort things out. But Toussaint knew the score. He was aware that the French had come to reclaim the island by any means necessary, and diplomacy was merely the veneer over a loaded cannon. What followed was a series of negotiations that made the Game of Thrones look like a tea party. Toussaint attempted to maintain a facade of cooperation, while preparing for the inevitable showdown. He was like a poker player with an impressive bluff, holding a hand that was both strong and precarious. Yet, despite his best efforts, the house of cards was about to collapse. The betrayal that led to Toussaint's arrest was the stuff of Shakespearean drama. It was none other than his own generals, men who had once stood by his side, who would deliver him into French hands. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, notable revolutionaries in their own right, switched allegiances, swayed by promises of power, and perhaps a return to the old ways of economic prosperity. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that loyalty is often a luxury few can afford. On June 7, 1802, under the guise of a friendly meeting, Toussaint was arrested, a move that was as much a surprise to him as a sudden Caribbean storm. He was taken aboard a French ship and whisked away to Europe. Imagine the shock. One moment you're a revolutionary leader, the next you're on a one-way trip to a European prison. It was like being the star of your own action movie, only to find out you're in a tragic biopic. Toussaint was transported to Fort de Joux in the French Alps, a place as cold as the betrayal that brought him there. There he languished, cut off from the world he had fought so hard to change. He died on April 7, 1803, in a cell that was as frigid as the political climate that had entombed him. It was a quiet end for a man whose life had been anything but. Now, let's address the legends surrounding Toussaint's prophetic dreams. Some say he foresaw his own demise and the eventual independence of Haiti. It's a romantic notion, sure, but let's ground ourselves in reality. Toussaint was a visionary, not a clairvoyant. He understood the tides of history because he was swimming in them, not because he had a crystal ball. The truth is, his downfall was a result of political machinations and power plays, not mystical foresight. Toussaint Louverture's story, with all its myths and harsh realities, is a testament to the unpredictable nature of revolutions and the leaders they produce. He was a man who dared to challenge the status quo, to dream of a future unshackled from the past. Yet, even the most audacious dreams can be undone by the cold, hard truths of power and politics. As we leave Toussaint in his Alpine prison, remember that his legacy was far from frozen. The seeds he planted would grow into a full-fledged revolution, leading to the birth of the first black republic in the world. But that's a tale for another day, as the revolution was still very much alive, simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt in ways that not even the most prophetic of dreams could have predicted. So, Toussaint Louverture's body was confined to a chilly cell in the French Alps, but his spirit? That was a whole other story. Even as he languished behind bars, he was more of a threat to the colonial order than most were with an army at their back. Why? Because his legacy was like an idea whose time had come, and no amount of cold stone or iron bars could freeze that. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Toussaint's final days weren't the stuff of epic poems. They were grim, marked by isolation, illness, and an absence of the world he had so fiercely tried to change. His prison cell was a mere 20 square meters smaller than some studio apartments, and temperatures regularly dipped below freezing. This wasn't just a cell, it was a calculated move by Napoleon to silence a man who had become a symbol of defiance. But here's the kicker. While Napoleon might have thought he was putting Toussaint's story on ice, he was actually firing the starting gun for the next chapter of the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint's arrest didn't snuff out the flame of revolution, it fanned it. His removal created a power vacuum that others rushed to fill, notably Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint's former ally and one-time betrayer. With Toussaint out of the picture, Dessalines stepped up to lead the charge against the French, and he wasn't about to play nice. The gloves were off, the stakes were high, and the battle for Haiti's independence was far from over. In January 1804, Dessalines declared Haiti's independence. This wasn't just a victory, it was a seismic shift. The world had its first black republic, a beacon of hope and a harbinger of change. Toussaint, even in his absence, had laid the groundwork for this audacious act. His relentless drive for autonomy and equality had set the stage for a narrative rewrite on a global scale. Haiti's independence was a direct challenge to the colonial status quo, and a stark reminder that the oppressed could, indeed, break their chains. And here's where we debunk the hero narrative a bit. Toussaint Louverture wasn't a flawless hero in a fairy tale. He was a man navigating a world rife with contradictions. He was a pragmatist, a strategist, sometimes a bit of a tyrant, but also a visionary who saw beyond the immediate. He was human, not a demigod, and his story is richer for it. The grit and grind of his journey underscore the complexity of revolution. It's messy, it's imperfect, and it's driven by real people with real flaws. Economically speaking, the independence of Haiti was nothing short of a nightmare for the European powers. For France, losing Saint-Domingue meant losing their Caribbean cash cow, a colony that had once accounted for 2/3 of France's overseas trade. The economic repercussions were significant, and the shockwaves were felt across the Atlantic. The message was clear. The days of colonial empires ruling unchallenged were numbered. Toussaint's legacy is a testament to persistence, strategy, and the indomitable human spirit. He turned the world on its head, not with invincible armies or divine intervention, but with sheer will and cunning. His life teaches us that history isn't shaped by those who follow the rules, but by those who dare to rewrite them. Toussaint Louverture didn't just challenge the status quo, he shattered it, leaving behind a blueprint for resistance that would inspire generations to come. And while it's tempting to romanticize his story, to paint him as the perfect hero, the reality is far more compelling. He was a man who saw the cracks in a seemingly invincible system and knew how to widen them. He understood the power of ideas and how they could ripple through societies, breaking down walls that seemed impenetrable. In the end, Toussaint's story is a masterclass in resilience and the power of human agency. So, as we wrap up this tale, remember Toussaint Louverture not as a mythical figure, but as a man who dared to dream big in a world that was desperately trying to keep those dreams small. He was the embodiment of the possible, a reminder that even the coldest prison cell couldn't contain the warmth of a revolutionary idea. His life and legacy are a testament to the fact that true change is born from the courage to challenge the impossible, to rewrite the rules, and to keep fighting, even when the odds are stacked sky high. In the bustling markets of Thetford, England, a young Thomas Paine learned early on that life was as unpredictable as the British weather. Born in 1737 to a modest Quaker family, Paine's upbringing was far from what you'd call luxurious. His father, Joseph, was a staymaker. No, not a life coach for indecisive folks, but a craftsman who made the stiffening stays for corsets. Imagine a life where your livelihood depended on keeping people uncomfortably strapped in. Paine's mother, Frances, hailed from an Anglican background, adding a sprinkle of religious tension to the family dynamic. In the 18th century, England was a place where social mobility was about as common as a unicorn sighting. The Industrial Revolution was still warming up, and for most people, survival meant clinging to whatever trade they had. Paine, however, wasn't one to settle for the status quo, even if it meant stepping on a few toes. Figuratively, of course, though some might argue otherwise given his knack for controversy. He apprenticed under his father, learning the ins and outs of stay-making, but his restless mind was already wandering beyond the confines of boning and busks. By the time Paine was in his 20s, the socio-economic landscape of England was more Dickensian than delightful. The poor were getting poorer, the rich were getting richer, and the middle class was just trying not to implode from existential dread. It was a society ripe for change, or at least for someone with Paine's gumption to start poking the hornet's nest. He took up various jobs, including a brief stint as an excise officer. You might think of him as a precursor to the modern-day auditor, tasked with sniffing out tax evaders and smugglers. But in true Paine fashion, he got himself dismissed not once, but twice. The first time for failing to inspect goods properly, and the second for writing a pamphlet that called for a pay raise for his fellow officers. Yes, even back then, the pen was mightier than the paycheck. The socio-economic tensions of 18th century England were a breeding ground for radical ideas, and Paine was like a sponge for revolutionary thought. He was influenced by Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who were busy scribbling down ideas about individual rights and government accountability. These were radical notions at a time when monarchs still believed they had a divine right to rule, like toddlers convinced that cookies were a basic human right. In 1774, Paine decided that England wasn't big enough for his ideas. Maybe he saw the writing on the wall, or maybe he just needed a change of scenery, but he set his sights on America. Crossing the Atlantic was no small feat back then. It wasn't a quick jaunt with complimentary peanuts and in-flight movies. The journey took anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the weather and how many times you got seasick. Passengers often paid around 5 to 10 for the trip, a hefty sum for someone who had just been sacked from a government job. Paine, however, had a stroke of luck, or perhaps divine intervention, when he met Benjamin Franklin in London. Franklin, who was practically the Yoda of the American Enlightenment, took a liking to Paine and gave him a letter of recommendation. With this golden ticket in hand, Paine boarded the ship and set sail for the New World. The voyage was anything but a pleasure cruise. The cramped quarters, the constant rocking of the ship, and the delightful aroma of seasickness all blended into a cocktail of discomfort. Yet, for Paine, it was a passage not just across the ocean, but into a new chapter of his life. America was a land teetering on the brink of revolution, and Paine's arrival was like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. He landed in Philadelphia, a city that would soon become a hotbed of revolutionary fervor. Paine's transatlantic leap wasn't just a geographical shift, it was a mental and ideological one. England had been his crucible, the place where his ideas were forged in the fires of economic disparity and political oppression. But it was in America that those ideas would catch fire. The socio-political landscape of the colonies was ripe for someone with Paine's audacity. The American colonists were chafing under British rule, their patience as thin as a staymaker's whalebone, and Paine was about to give them the push they needed to break free from their corset of colonial oppression. In essence, Paine's early life was a testament to the power of dissatisfaction as a catalyst for change. He was a man who didn't just dream of a better world, he wrote about it, loudly and unapologetically. His journey from a staymaker in Thetford to a revolutionary pamphleteer in America is a story of transformation fueled by equal parts frustration and hope. As he settled into his new life in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine was ready to unleash his ideas on a world that was, quite frankly, not ready for the storm he was about to unleash. But that, dear friends, is a tale for another time. And so, with the salt of the Atlantic still crusted on his boots, Thomas Paine found himself in the bustling streets of Philadelphia, a city where the air was thick with ideas and the occasional whiff of horse manure. It was 1774, and Paine, armed with his quill and a head full of revolutionary notions, was ready to dive into the fray. But before he could shake the political world, he had to find his footing in a new land, like a rock star trying to sell records without a label. Fast forward to January 1776, and Paine was about to drop the mixtape of the century, Common Sense. Clocking in at a brisk 47 pages, this little pamphlet packed a punch that would make a heavyweight boxer jealous. If Paine were alive today, he'd probably be the kind of guy who'd break Twitter with a single tweet. Common Sense wasn't just a pamphlet, it was a battering ram aimed squarely at the doors of British colonial authority. It was like Paine took the smouldering grumbling of the colonies and doused it with verbal gasoline. Now let's put this into perspective. Back in the day, pamphlets were the social media posts of the 18th century. They were cheap, easy to produce, and could spread faster than gossip at a Victorian tea party. But here's the kicker. Paine's pamphlet sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months. In a population of roughly 2.5 million colonists, that was like getting a YouTube video to go viral before the internet even existed. Everyone from farmers to founding fathers was reading it, and Paine's words resonated like a freedom-loving earworm. What made Common Sense so explosively popular? It was Paine's knack for cutting through the political mumbo-jumbo and speaking directly to the average Joe or Josephine on the street. He argued that it was sheer lunacy for an island to rule a continent, that monarchy was an outdated relic, and that America had the right, no, the duty, to break free from British rule. Paine didn't mince words, stating, "There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." It was a mic-drop moment that left the colonial elite scrambling to catch up. But as much as Paine's words were a revolution in print, getting them onto paper was another story. Enter the world of 18th century publishing, a chaotic circus where printers were the reluctant ringmasters. Printing was a painstaking process involving heavy machinery, ink-stained fingers, and a fair amount of swearing. Printers were often skeptical of controversial material, fearing it might land them in hot water, or worse, in front of a judge. Paine, ever the persuasive talker, managed to wrangle a few brave souls willing to take the risk. And here's where the humour kicks in. Picture Paine, with his fiery rhetoric, trying to convince a wary printer to publish something that could theoretically get them both tarred and feathered. It's said that some printers were so reluctant, Paine had to promise them anonymity or a share in the profits to sweeten the deal. Imagine their surprise when Common Sense became the 18th century equivalent of a blockbuster hit. Suddenly, those printers were like lottery winners, clutching their ink-stained winnings with glee. Economically speaking, the pamphlet trade was a bit like the Wild West of publishing. Without the digital convenience of e-books or print on demand, Each copy was laboriously typeset and pressed by hand. Printing 100,000 copies was no small feat, and it required a network of printers, distributors, and hawkers to get the pamphlets into the hands of eager readers. The cost of printing, common sense, was relatively low, around a few pence per copy, but the return on investment was immense, not just financially, but in the currency of revolutionary fervour. As common sense spread, it was clear that Paine had struck a chord. His arguments were simple, direct, and unflinchingly bold. He called for independence at a time when many colonial leaders were still tiptoeing around the idea, trying to mend fences with Britain. Paine's writing was like a breath of fresh, albeit incendiary, air. He didn't just advocate for change, he demanded it, and he made it sound like the most logical, common-sense thing in the world. But let's not romanticize too much. For all its impact, common sense was also a product of its time, a reflection of the economic and political tensions simmering in the colonies. The pamphlet's success wasn't just about Paine's eloquence. It was about a society on the brink of transformation. The American colonists were fed up with taxes, trade restrictions, and a distant monarchy that seemed as out of touch as a modern-day politician without a social media account. Paine's pamphlet didn't just sell copies, it sold an idea, one that resonated with a population ready for change. It was a catalyst, turning discontent into action and sparking debates in taverns, town halls, and homes across the colonies. In short, common sense was the match that lit the fuse of the American Revolution. Its success was a testament to the power of words to inspire, incite, and push people towards a new vision of their future. And so, as the dust of the printing presses settled and the ink dried, Paine's common sense had done more than just sell 100,000 copies. It had helped to shape the destiny of a nation. But this was just the beginning of Paine's journey. He had more to say, more battles to fight, and more ink to spill. His words would continue to reverberate through the pages of history, challenging authority, inspiring action, and proving, once again, that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply speak your mind. As the ink dried on the pages of Common Sense, Thomas Paine found himself not just a pamphleteer, but a revolutionary celebrity. But fame, as we all know, doesn't pay the bills, and Paine was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The American Revolution wasn't just about lofty ideals, it was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Picture Paine, juggling the demands of rhetoric and revolution like a harried circus performer. He might have been a maestro with the quill, but that didn't stop the wolf from knocking at his door. So, what happens when the man who ignited a revolution with his words finds himself struggling to keep the ink flowing? Enter the Continental Army, an entity as cash-strapped as Paine himself. America's fledgling military was in desperate need of morale and money, and guess who they turned to for a little verbal CPR? That's right, our man Tom. In December 1776, when the army's spirits were lower than a limbo stick at a Caribbean beach party, Paine penned The American Crisis. It wasn't just another pamphlet, it was a clarion call to arms, a verbal Red Bull for weary revolutionaries. And boy did they need it. Washington's troops were huddled, freezing, and contemplating the joys of desertion, while the British sipped tea and mused about their next move. But then came Paine's opening line, "These are the times that try men's souls." It was the kind of sentence that slapped you awake and demanded you do something about your predicament. Paine had a unique ability to cut through the bitter chill of a New Jersey winter and warm the hearts of soldiers who were one setback away from calling it quits. His words were like a roaring fire in a snowstorm, a reminder of why they were fighting in the first place. But let's not sugarcoat it. Paine wasn't just rallying troops for the fun of it. He was knee-deep in financial struggles that would make a modern-day freelancer wince. Revolution, it turns out, is an expensive hobby. Despite his influence, Paine's bank account was as barren as a British cupboard after a tea party. He wasn't above asking for funds, but America's revolutionary coffers were emptier than a barrel of gunpowder after a skirmish. The Continental Congress, generous with praise but stingy with cash, occasionally tossed Paine a bone. Yet he found himself constantly scraping by, a revolutionary writer caught in the irony of fighting for independence while shackled by debt. Paine's humour, however, never quite deserted him. His takes on the British monarchy were laced with a sarcasm that would make any stand-up comedian proud. He famously quipped about King George III. A cottager, with no wealth and no power, is a better man than a king. Paine had a knack for reducing monarchical pomposity to the absurd, much like taking a pin to a balloon covered in royal regalia. His writings often painted the British as out-of-touch elitists, ruling over America with the same finesse as a blindfolded juggler handling a set of knives. But back to the army, where Paine's flair for words was more potent than a dozen muskets. His writings didn't just rally the troops, they shamed Congress into action. When he wasn't scribbling fiery prose, Paine served as an aide-de-camp to General Nathanael Greene, sharing in the gritty realities of army life. His proximity to the battlefield lent his words an authenticity that resonated with soldiers who knew firsthand the price of liberty. Paine was in the trenches, both literally and figuratively, and his work reflected the visceral urgency of a nation fighting for its life. Now, about those financial woes. You'd think a man who could inspire a nation might get a little fiscal love, but alas, Paine's revolutionary credentials didn't come with a paycheck. He once remarked with a touch of self-deprecation that he was more in debt than anybody in America. It was an exaggeration, sure, but it captured the frustrating reality of balancing idealism with economic pragmatism. Even as the American crisis buoyed the spirits of a fledgling nation, Paine was left to wonder if he'd ever see a return on his revolutionary investment. Still, Paine plugged away, undeterred by empty pockets or the looming spectre of debtor's prison. In a world where the price of independence was often paid in blood, Paine's contribution was ink that fueled the revolutionary engine with a steady stream of hope and defiance. His words were like a draught of courage, imbibed by soldiers on the brink of despair. And when the going got tough, it was Paine's pen that proved mightier than the sword, rallying a nation with the promise of a brighter, independent future. As the war dragged on, Paine's role as the revolution's unofficial hype man continued to evolve. His ability to distill complex political realities into everyday language made him a crucial asset. Paine didn't just write for the intellectual elite, he wrote for the everyman, the farmer turned soldier, the shopkeeper turned militiaman. His prose was raw, passionate, and unflinching, a clarion call to arms that resonated from the halls of Congress to the muddy encampments of the Continental Army. In essence, Paine was the rock star of revolutionary rhetoric, with all the glamour and none of the royalties. He wrote for a cause greater than himself, driven by an insatiable desire to see America free from British tyranny. And while the revolution may not have been kind to his pocketbook, it was inarguably kind to his legacy. Paine's words helped shape the narrative of American independence, making him an indispensable figure in the annals of history. So, as Paine continued to weave his way through the turbulent years of the American Revolution, he remained a beacon of hope and resilience. His writings served as a reminder that the fight for freedom was never just about muskets and battles. It was about ideas and the power of the written word to inspire a nation. And while Paine may have found himself constantly in need of funds, his contributions to the revolutionary cause were, in every sense, priceless. As the war ground on, the irony of Paine's financial woes became a running joke among his friends and contemporaries. Here was a man whose pen had lit the fires of independence, yet he couldn't afford to light his own hearth. But Paine, ever the optimist, persisted. His belief in the American cause was unwavering, his resolve as steadfast as the soldiers he sought to inspire. And though his bank account might have been in the red, his influence was undeniably golden, a testament to the enduring power of words in the fight for freedom. And so, Paine's journey through the American Revolution continued, a saga of words and warfare that would echo through the ages. His story, like the revolution itself, was far from over, and the pages of history awaited the next chapter in his remarkable tale. As the ink dried on the last chapter of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine was ready to embark on yet another transatlantic adventure. This time, his destination was the frenetic landscape of revolutionary France, where his quill would continue to make waves. Paine, ever the globe-trotting agitator, returned to Europe in 1707, drawn by the siren call of political upheaval. It was like a moth to a flame, or more aptly, a pamphleteer to a printing press. He arrived in Paris with the optimism of a man who had just witnessed one revolution and was eager to contribute to another. But, as history often reminds us, the road to revolution is paved with good intentions and, occasionally, the heads of fallen monarchs. Paine's timing was impeccable, arriving just as France was gearing up for its own seismic shift. He soon found himself swept up in the French Revolution, a tumultuous period that made the American upheaval look like a tea party in comparison. Paine, who had already proven he could stir a pot with his writing, saw an opportunity to unleash his ideas on a new stage. In 1791, he published The Rights of Man, a two-part treatise that took aim at the British monarchy and aristocracy with the precision of a well-aimed musket. The Rights of Man was more than just ink on paper. It was a philosophical hand grenade tossed into the lap of British society. In its first 2 years, it sold a staggering 50,000 copies. Now, in a world without Amazon or overnight shipping, that's akin to achieving bestseller status on sheer force of argument alone. Paine's prose was a clarion call for individual rights and egalitarianism, challenging the notion that some people were born to rule while others were destined to grovel. He argued for the dismantling of hereditary privilege, stating, "All men are born equal and with equal natural rights." It was a declaration that sent shivers down the spines of the British elite, who suddenly found themselves at the business end of Paine's rhetorical cannon. The British establishment, predictably, was not amused. The Rights of Man was banned, and Paine was charged with seditious libel. The irony was thicker than a London fog. Here was a man who had helped birth a nation with his writing, now branded a traitor in his homeland. The authorities, clearly no fans of free speech when it threatened their comfy status quo, issued a warrant for his arrest. Paine, ever the quick thinker, fled to France before the ink on his arrest warrant had even dried. In France, Paine was welcomed as a hero of liberty, a living embodiment of revolutionary ideals. But let's not get too carried away with the romantic image of Paine as a French revolutionary icon. The truth, as always, is a bit more complicated. While he was elected to the National Convention, Paine found himself in a political minefield that made the American Revolution look like a game of hopscotch. The French Revolution was a messy, bloody affair, rife with factions, infighting, and enough backstabbing to make a Shakespearean drama look tame. Paine's idealism, so well suited to the American context, struggled to find its footing amid the chaos of French politics. He campaigned against the execution of King Louis XVI, advocating instead for exile. This stance earned him few friends among the radical Jacobins, who were more interested in swift, bloody justice than in Paine's ideas of mercy. And so, the myth of Paine as a French revolutionary hero started to unravel. Instead of riding a wave of revolutionary fervour, Paine found himself caught in the cross-currents of political intrigue. His situation took a turn for the worse during the Reign of Terror, a period of paranoia and purges led by Robespierre and his ilk. Paine, who had taken the idea of freedom a bit too literally, was arrested and imprisoned in December 793. He spent nearly a year in the Luxembourg prison, narrowly escaping execution by what can only be described as a clerical error. The legend goes that a prison warden, tasked with marking doors of those slated for the guillotine, mistakenly left Paine's unmarked when the door swung open at the crucial moment. It's the kind of story that smacks of divine intervention or, more likely, the fickle hand of fate. As Paine languished in prison, the harsh reality of the French Revolution set in. He was not the adored hero of liberty that many had imagined, but a foreigner caught in the throes of a revolution that devoured its own with alarming regularity. The romantic image of Paine as a champion of freedom was tempered by the brutal truth of political survival. While his writings had sparked ideas of equality and rights, the realities of revolutionary France were a stark reminder that ideals often clashed violently with human nature. Yet, despite the hardships, Paine's spirit remained unbroken. He continued to write, penning letters and essays that would later be compiled into The Age of Reason. His works during this period reflected a man grappling with the complexities of faith, reason, and the human condition. But more on that in the next chapter. For now, we're left with a picture of Paine as both hero and prisoner, a visionary whose life was as unpredictable as the revolutions he inspired. And so, as the guillotine loomed large and the shadows of the Reign of Terror lengthened, Thomas Paine's story took another dramatic turn. He emerged from prison, a changed man, his faith in humanity tested but not extinguished. His journey was far from over, and history had yet more twists and turns in store for the ever-controversial revolutionary. Stay tuned, because if there's one thing Paine's life teaches us, It's that the pen might be mightier than the sword, but it's just as unpredictable. Emerging from the shadows of imprisonment, Thomas Paine faced a world that was a bit less enamored with his brand of radicalism. The French Revolution, once a beacon of hope, had become a cautionary tale of extremism gone wild. For Paine, who had narrowly dodged the guillotine, it was a wake-up call that sometimes the fire of revolution can burn a little too brightly. As he made his way back to America in 1802, he found the political landscape as unfamiliar as a new pair of shoes that pinched in all the wrong places. America had changed, and not necessarily for the better in Paine's eyes. The country was now under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, a man Paine had once counted as an ally. But the political climate was shifting towards conservatism, and Paine's radical ideas were about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. His earlier triumphs, like common sense, were now overshadowed by the growing perception of him as a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser whose pen was too sharp for comfort. Paine's return to America was marked by a stark reality check. Fame is fickle, and revolutionary credentials don't necessarily translate to popularity or prosperity. He was met with a cold shoulder from former friends and political allies who were now more interested in stability than in Paine's brand of revolutionary fervour. To put it bluntly, Paine was about as popular as a rainstorm at a parade. His later years were a struggle, both financially and socially. Paine, never one to shy away from controversy, continued to write, though his works were met with mixed reactions. His Age of Reason, an assault on organized religion, was particularly divisive. Paine argued for deism, promoting reason and scientific inquiry over religious dogma. He wrote, "My own mind is my own church," a sentiment that resonated with some but outraged many others. If Paine's life were a modern tabloid, it would be filled with headlines screaming scandal. His criticism of religion turned many against him, and his reputation was further tarnished by rumours and personal attacks. It was whispered that Paine was an atheist, a drunk, and worse, a surefire way to alienate oneself in a society that was still deeply religious. Fast forward to 1889, and Paine's health was deteriorating. He was living in New York, grappling with illness and poverty, a far cry from the revolutionary hero he once was. Paine died on June 8, 1809, at the age of 72. In death, as in life, he remained controversial. Only 6 people reportedly attended his funeral, a stark reminder that his radicalism had not won him many friends in his later years. Here's where the myths start swirling like autumn leaves in a gale. One popular tale claims that Paine's bones were exhumed and shipped to England by a zealous admirer, only to be lost to history. It's a deliciously Gothic story, but the truth is likely less cinematic. While his remains were indeed exhumed with the intention of a grand reburial, what happened afterward is murky, with no concrete evidence to support the more outlandish claims. In essence, Paine's posthumous journey became as enigmatic as the man himself. But while Paine's personal life might have ended in obscurity, his legacy was anything but. His writings, particularly Common Sense and the Rights of Man, became foundational texts for democratic movements worldwide. His ideas on individual rights and government accountability continue to influence political thought, offering a blueprint for those seeking to challenge authority and champion human rights. Paine's prophetic insights into democracy were prescient, anticipating debates that continue to this day about the role of government and the rights of citizens. Paine's story is a testament to the power of the written word in shaping political landscapes. His ability to distill complex ideas into accessible language made him a voice for the voiceless, a champion of the common man in a world dominated by elites. Yet, his life also serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of radicalism and the personal sacrifices that often accompany a commitment to change. Despite the controversies, Paine's legacy endures. His writings remind us that democracy is an ongoing experiment, one that requires constant vigilance and courage. Paine once wrote, "The mind once enlightened cannot again become dark." His words continue to shine a light on the path to justice and equality, challenging us to think critically and act boldly in the pursuit of a better world. And so, the story of Thomas Paine concludes not with a whimper, but with a resonant echo that reverberates through history. He was a man unafraid to speak truth to power, even at great personal cost. In a world that often rewards conformity, Paine stood as a beacon of defiance, a reminder that sometimes the bravest act is simply to question the status quo. In the end, Paine's life was as tumultuous as the revolutions he inspired. He was a visionary whose ideas transcended his time, leaving an indelible mark on the world. His journey from obscurity to revolutionary icon and back again is a story of courage, conviction, and the enduring power of ideas to change the world. As we reflect on his legacy, we're reminded of the timeless truth that while the pen may be mightier than the sword, it is also the tool of dreamers and dissenters, the ones who dare to imagine a better future for all. The first thing you hear is the relentless roar of the North Sea, a sound as constant as your heartbeat. It's the kind of noise that makes you appreciate the simple miracle of earplugs. But you're a Viking Shieldmaiden in 9th century Scandinavia, and earplugs haven't been invented yet. So you rise with the dawn, shake the sleep from your eyes, and take a deep breath of salty air that smells like adventure. Or maybe just fish. Your morning routine is not what the legend makers would have you believe. Sure, you might have a sword hanging on the wall, but it's the plough that sees more action. Viking society, after all, was as much about farming as it was about fighting. The land was your lifeline, a sprawling patchwork of fields and fjords that kept your community alive. And believe it or not, the most feared sea raiders of their day spent a surprising amount of their time elbow deep in dirt. But before you start digging trenches, there's breakfast to consider. Viking mornings weren't about leisurely brunches with avocado toast. Instead, you'd likely find yourself gnawing on a piece of flatbread, maybe slathered with some butter if you were lucky. Protein might come from yesterday's catch or a bit of smoked meat, and if you really want to spoil yourself, a sip of ale to wash it down. Remember, this is the time when water purification was as mythical as the dragons on your longship's prow. Now, let's bust a few myths about your fellow Vikings. You might think of them as a bunch of burly, unkempt brutes. The truth is, they actually took their grooming quite seriously. Combs, razors, and tweezers have been found in graves, suggesting that personal hygiene was a thing even back then. So, you might spend a few minutes untangling your hair or scraping your teeth clean with a twig before gearing up for the day. As a Shieldmaiden, you play a critical role in your society, one that's often glossed over in tales of male heroism. While the sagas and poems love to paint Viking women as fierce warriors, and some certainly were, the reality is more nuanced. Women in Viking culture wielded considerable influence, managing farms, and even holding the keys to the family wealth, quite literally. Key-shaped brooches found in their graves weren't just for show, they symbolized their authority over the household's economic resources. Economically, your community is far from isolated. The Vikings are traders as much as they are raiders, with networks stretching from the icy reaches of the North Atlantic to the vibrant bazaars of Constantinople. Your settlement thrives on this exchange, dealing in everything from furs and amber to slaves and silver. In this interconnected web of trade, women often acted as intermediaries, managing local transactions while the men sailed off in search of riches or mischief or both. But let's not forget the harsh realities behind the romanticized image of the Viking warrior. Life as a Shieldmaiden isn't all epic battles and glorious death songs. Most of your days are filled with the mundane but essential tasks of keeping the settlement running. Farming, weaving, and managing supplies aren't just chores, they're the backbone of your society. It's these daily labours that sustain your people through the long, dark winters when the North Sea's roar becomes an icy whisper against the stone walls of your home. Yet, there's a certain empowerment in this routine. While the men are off on raids, you and the other women hold the fort quite literally. You manage the household, control the resources, and ensure that everything is in place when, or if, they return. In a world that romanticizes the battle, it's the quiet strength of those who stay behind that often goes unsung. As you step out into the brisk morning air, you catch a glimpse of the settlement around you. The longhouses, with their thatched roofs and sturdy wooden frames, are arranged in a cluster, a testament to the communal spirit of Viking life. Each house is a hive of activity, with smoke curling up from chimneys, children darting between doorways, and the ever-present sound of the sea as a backdrop. The political landscape is as rugged as the coastline. Your chieftain owes allegiance, not to a king, but to a network of alliances and rivalries that shift like the tides. Decisions are made in the Thing, a gathering of free men, and sometimes women, where disputes are settled and plans for the future are laid out. It's a system that values consensus and communal wisdom, a far cry from the top-down monarchies of Europe. But for now, politics can wait. There's work to be done, fields to tend, and livestock to feed. As you head to the barn, you can't help but chuckle at the thought of what some 21st century folks might say if they saw you now, mucking out stalls instead of brandishing a sword. Yet, in these tasks, you find a rhythm, a connection to the land and to your ancestors who tilled these same fields. So, while the legends may sing of dragon ships and storming distant shores, you know the truth of your life. It's a mix of grit and grace, of quiet resilience and the occasional flash of fierceness. It's the life of a Viking Shieldmaiden, where the day begins with the sea's call and ends with the satisfaction of a hard day's work, etched into the lines of your hands. As you finish up with the morning chores, you turn your thoughts to the part of the day that definitely doesn't involve manure, training. Now, I know what you're thinking. Images of fierce women brandishing swords, shields glinting in the sun, and the soundtrack of some epic movie playing in the background. But let's take a step back from Hollywood, shall we? First off, the weapons. A Viking Shieldmaiden's arsenal wasn't a grab bag of random sharp objects. Swords were, in fact, something of a luxury item. A well-crafted sword could take up to a month to forge and might cost the equivalent of a small farm. So while you might have a sword, it's more likely that your go-to weapon was a spear. Spears were versatile, cheaper, and frankly, a lot more practical for the kind of skirmishes Vikings found themselves in. Then there's the shield, the iconic emblem of the Viking warrior. Most Viking shields were round, made from wood planks glued together and reinforced with leather and iron. They spanned about 80 to 90 centimeters in diameter, just large enough to protect your vitals, but light enough to maneuver in a fight. And here's a fun fact, they weren't just for defense. Vikings used their shields as offensive tools too, bashing enemies in the face with them. It's all about multitasking, right? Now, let's talk about armor. The romantic image of chainmail-clad warriors is mostly a fantasy. Sure, chainmail existed, but it was the Rolls-Royce of armor, reserved for those with serious cash or connections. Most of you would be wearing a leather jerkin, maybe with some metal bits sewn on for extra protection. It's functional, affordable, and doesn't make you sink like a stone if you need to swim for your life. Combat tactics in Viking times were less about epic duels and more about organized chaos. The shield wall, for example, was a classic Viking formation. Imagine a human tank, rows of warriors interlocking their shields to create a near-impenetrable barrier. It's teamwork at its grittiest, and it required discipline and coordination qualities not usually associated with the stereotype of the wild Viking berserker. But let's not get carried away with visions of constant battle. The reality is, Viking warfare was sporadic and opportunistic. Raids were often about quick strikes, snatching up goods, and getting out before the locals organized a strong defense. Prolonged campaigns were rare because, frankly, they were expensive and logistically nightmarish. Most Vikings spent far more time farming than fighting, which means, as a Shieldmaiden, so did you. So how did women end up on the battlefield in the first place? Well, Viking society was surprisingly egalitarian in some respects. While not exactly a feminist utopia, women had more rights and autonomy than in many other parts of medieval Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and yes, fight alongside men. The sagas, those epic tales passed down through generations, give glimpses of women taking up arms, although it's always a bit tricky to separate legend from fact. Archaeological evidence does back up the idea of women warriors. For years, the famous Burka warrior grave was assumed to belong to a man, until DNA testing revealed it to be a woman. She was buried with a full complement of weapons, suggesting she was a respected warrior in her own right. It's a fascinating twist in the narrative that even the most skeptical historians can't ignore. The societal structures that allowed women to participate in warfare were built on necessity as much as ideology. In a world where survival often depended on numbers, anyone who could wield a weapon was valuable. And let's face it, when your husband and brothers are off on a raid, someone has to be ready to defend the homestead. So, as you strap on your gear and head to the training ground, remember that your role as a Shieldmaiden is as much about practicality as it is about prestige. You're not just a warrior. You're a guardian of your community, a custodian of your people's future. Each swing of your spear, Each maneuver with your shield is a testament to the complex tapestry of Viking life. A life that's far richer and more nuanced than the clichés would have you believe. As the day progresses, you join your fellow shield maidens and warriors in the clearing that doubles as a training ground. It's a scene of controlled chaos, with the sounds of metal on metal, the shouts of instructors, and the occasional yelp when someone gets a little too enthusiastic. Training is rigorous, demanding both physical endurance and mental acuity. You don't just swing weapons around, you learn tactics, formations, and how to read an opponent's moves. This disciplined approach to training reflects the larger societal values of the Viking world. Much like the Thing, where communal decisions are made, training is a collective effort. Everyone pulls their weight. The skills you hone here are as vital to the community as the crops you plant or the goods you barter. And let's not ignore the economic implications of warfare. Raiding is as much a business venture as it is a military endeavor. Successful raids bring back wealth in the form of goods, slaves, and even future trade opportunities. But it's a risky business, and a failed raid can leave a community devastated. That's why the training is relentless. Everyone needs to be prepared because the stakes are high. As the sun sinks lower in the sky, turning the landscape into a watercolor of oranges and purples, you wrap up the day's training. You're tired, sure, but there's a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that you're part of something larger than yourself. The camaraderie among your fellow shield maidens is a bond forged in sweat and effort, one that's as unbreakable as the iron of your spearhead. As you make your way back to the settlement, the evening air cool against your skin, you reflect on the day. The life of a Viking shield maiden is far from the romanticized tales told in sagas and Hollywood scripts, but it's richer, more textured. It's a life balanced on the edge of a sword, between the demands of the land and the call of the sea, between legend and the stark realities of survival. And as you settle in for the night, the crackling of the hearth, the only sound in the quiet of the longhouse, you know that tomorrow will bring more of the same. More training, more work, more living in this harsh yet beautiful world. But for now, you rest, knowing that you are part of a legacy that stretches back through time, a legacy of strength, resilience, and a little bit of grit. The hearth's warmth fades as you drift into slumber, cradled by dreams of distant lands and the echo of the morning's training. By dawn, you're back on your feet, ready to swap the spear for something a little less lethal, a basket. Today, you're off to the local market, a bustling hub that connects your coastal village to a world far beyond the North Sea's icy embrace. Now, if you're picturing a quaint farmer's market with artisanal cheese and organic veggies, think again. This is a Viking market, where the smell of smoked fish mingles with the earthy scent of furs, and barter is the language of commerce, not cash. Coins are rare and mostly foreign. Silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, perhaps, or the occasional Byzantine solidus. Here, value is in the eye of the beholder, and a haggled price is as much about social standing as it is about goods. You join the throng of traders and villagers, your path weaving through stalls laden with treasures and trinkets from across the known world. The Viking trade network was the medieval equivalent of Amazon Prime, if Amazon had boats instead of drones and the occasional raid to spice things up. Your settlement is a small cog in a vast machine that stretches from the British Isles to the opulent bazaars of Constantinople. Let's talk merchandise. Furs are a staple, the North's answer to gold. The pelts of Arctic foxes, reindeer, and even polar bears are highly prized, especially in the warmer climes of Europe and the Middle East. You also see amber, the gold of the North, gleaming in the morning light. This fossilized tree resin is more than just pretty. It's a status symbol in the courts of Europe and beyond. You can almost hear the Byzantine nobles whispering about their latest acquisitions, as if these lumps of hardened sap were the medieval equivalent of a sports car. But it's not all about luxury. Everyday items have their place too. See that pile of whetstones over there? They come from Norway's quarries, sharpening blades and tools from Dublin to Novgorod. And don't forget the slaves. Human commodities traded as brutally as any other goods, a grim reminder that not all exchanges are equal. This dark reality is a stain on the Viking legacy, but it's a fact of the era, woven into the fabric of society like the sails on a longship. The economic implications of this trade are monumental. Prosperity flows from every deal struck. every handshake made over a freshly negotiated price. This influx of wealth fuels the construction of more ships, the expansion of settlements, and the occasional indulgence in foreign luxuries. Silks from the East, spices from Arabia, or the odd bottle of fine wine. Trade isn't just an activity. It's the lifeblood of your community, binding you to lands and peoples far beyond the horizon. Political and social ties flourish amidst this bustling exchange. The market is more than just a venue for commerce. It's a crucible where alliances are forged and rivalries simmer. Chieftains and traders swap stories and strategies, weaving a web of connections as intricate as any spiders. These relationships can be as beneficial as they are volatile, a delicate dance of diplomacy that requires as much skill as swinging a sword. Cultural exchanges are inevitable when people and goods are in constant motion. As you stroll past stalls, you catch snippets of foreign tongues, Old English, Frankish, even the occasional Arabic. Ideas travel with as much ease as objects, reshaping Viking society in subtle ways. The fashion choices, the food, even the occasional architectural flourish owe their existence to this melting pot of commerce. And if you think the Vikings were just rough-hewn warriors with no taste for the finer things, think again. The influx of wealth and foreign influence nurtures a sophisticated culture where artistry thrives. Jewelry crafted with intricate designs, often influenced by the styles of distant lands, is a testament to this. Your own brooch, perhaps a gift from a successful raid or trade, sparkles with the handiwork of a master artisan. Despite the romantic allure of this vibrant trade hub, it's not all smooth sailing. The market is also a place of tension, where competitive traders jockey for position and the occasional dispute flares like a summer storm. Yet, even in its chaos, there's a rhythm, an order born of necessity and shared purpose. The market is the beating heart of your community, a place where the pulse of Viking life is most vividly felt. As the day unfolds, you find yourself haggling over a particularly fine piece of amber, its warm glow a stark contrast to the chill in the air. The merchant, a seasoned negotiator with a twinkle in his eye, knows the game as well as you do. It's a dance of words, a battle of wits, and when you finally strike a deal, there's a shared nod of respect. In this world, every transaction is a story, every exchange a thread in the tapestry of Viking life. As the sun dips towards the horizon, casting long shadows over the market, you gather your purchases and head home. The journey back is a time for reflection, the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot, a counterpoint to your thoughts. You ponder the interconnectedness of it all, the goods, the people, the ideas, and how they shape your world. This trade network is a lifeline, a testament to the Viking spirit of exploration and enterprise. It's not just about acquiring wealth, it's about forging connections, expanding horizons, and embracing the unknown. The market is a microcosm of the Viking experience, where the boundaries between legend and reality blur and the promise of adventure is as tangible as the goods in your basket. And as you step back into the familiar embrace of your settlement, you realize that the market is more than just a place of commerce. It's a reflection of your identity, a mirror held up to the world that shows not just who you are, but who you might become. The stories of trade and travel, of goods and gold, are the stories of your people, stories that continue to unfold with each passing day. So, while the sagas may sing of battles and glory, you know that the true heart of the Viking saga beats not just on the battlefield, but in the vibrant, chaotic, and endlessly fascinating world of trade. Here, among the furs and the amber, the coins and the conversations, the legacy of the Vikings lives on, ever-changing, ever-expanding, and ever-resilient. As you step back into the familiar embrace of your settlement, the vibrant chaos of the market still echoing in your mind, you're reminded that Viking life isn't just about trade or raiding. It's also about governance. And in 9th century Scandinavia, governance is a spectator sport. This afternoon holds a special event, the Thing. No, not a mysterious artifact or a creature from the north. It's the assembly where your community gathers to hash out the rules of the game. The Thing, believe it or not, is a democratic institution. Forget the image of despotic chieftains ruling with an iron fist. This is the Viking version of a town hall meeting, with all the drama and debate you'd expect from a group of free people who enjoy a good argument almost as much as they enjoy mead. And unlike the monarchies of medieval Europe, this isn't just a one-man show. It's a communal affair where even women, yes, including Shieldmaidens like you, can wield influence. Picture this. The community congregates in a broad open space, maybe a natural amphitheatre or a field framed by the fjords. It's a scene that could easily be mistaken for a festival, with families gathered, stalls offering food and drink, and the general buzz of social interaction. But the purpose is serious. There are disputes to resolve, laws to debate, and decisions that will shape the future of your village. In a world where oral tradition is king, the art of persuasion is as crucial as the art of war. To sway the thing, you need more than just a loud voice. Eloquence, wit, and a keen understanding of the law are your weapons here. And in a society where mythology and reality are often two sides of the same coin, the stories you tell can carry as much weight as the facts you present. Now, here's where it gets interesting. While men often dominate these discussions, women aren't mere spectators. Viking women hold sway in ways that would make their contemporaries in other parts of Europe green with envy. They can speak on issues that directly affect their property and families. And should they manage to deliver a particularly compelling argument, their voices can echo as powerfully as those of their male counterparts. The Thing is a testament to the Viking spirit of consensus and community. Decisions aren't made by decree, but through deliberation. Any free person can speak, and while the chieftain might steer the conversation, he is as bound by the will of the people as anyone. It's a political balance as precarious as a ship on a stormy sea, but it's one that has kept your society afloat through the ages. This democratic approach is not just a quirk of Viking culture, it's a necessity. In a society where alliances are as fluid as the tides, and where survival depends on cooperation, the ability to reach a consensus is vital. Disputes range from the mundane land boundaries, inheritance rights, to the existential, like whether to go to war. And in a world where a single bad decision can lead to famine, or worse, it's no wonder that everyone wants a say. But let's not pretend this is some idyllic utopia of egalitarian harmony. The Thing can be a battleground, a place where rivalries simmer just beneath the surface. Chieftains and their supporters jockey for position, using every trick in the book, from fiery rhetoric to whispered deals to tip the scales in their favour. It's a political soap opera that would make modern politicians blush, and as a Shieldmaiden you have a front row seat. Myth and reality often blur at the Thing. The sagas, the Viking equivalent of blockbuster movies, are recited to bolster arguments or sway opinions. A tale of a hero's cunning or a god's wrath can be just as persuasive as any logical argument. It's a reminder that in Viking society, the lines between fact and fiction are as malleable as the iron in your sword. This blending of law and law creates a societal structure that's as unique as it is complex. On one hand, you have a legal system that's surprisingly sophisticated, with laws codified and disputes settled through arbitration. On the other, you have a cultural landscape where myths are living, breathing entities, shaping perceptions as much as any earthly decree. As you stand among the crowd, listening to the debates unfold, you can't help but marvel at the intricate dance of power and persuasion. This is a world where words can be as sharp as any blade, where a well-timed story might sway the course of events more than any brute force. And while the Thing is primarily about governance, it's also a social event, a chance for the community to come together, to reaffirm bonds and renew rivalries. It's a reminder that, despite the harshness of your world, there is joy to be found in these gatherings, a celebration of the collective spirit that defines your people. As the afternoon wanes and the decisions are finally made, you reflect on the role you play in this grand tapestry. The life of a Shieldmaiden is more than just the clash of swords and raids on distant shores. It's about standing firm in the halls of power, about lending your voice to the chorus that shapes your world. So, while the legends may sing of battles and glory, you know that the true heart of the Viking saga beats not just on the battlefield, but in these gatherings where the future is forged not by steel, but by words and will. And as the Thing draws to a close, you know that tomorrow will bring more challenges, more debates, more of the relentless quest to carve out a place in the ever-changing world. For now, though, you head home, the echoes of the day's discussions still ringing in your ears, a reminder of the vibrant, complex world you call home. As the echoes of the Thing's debates still reverberate in your mind, the sun begins its slow descent behind the rugged silhouette of the fjords. Evening in the Viking world signals a shift from the cerebral to the celebratory. Tonight, your community gathers for a feast, a ritual as crucial to Viking society as any raid or trade mission. It's time to experience Viking cuisine and social rituals that are as flavorful as they are revealing. Let's set the scene. Long tables stretch out beneath the stars, laden with a feast that would make any modern dietitian wince. Forget kale salads and quinoa bowls. This is the age of carbs and protein. On the menu, there's no shortage of meat, roast boar, beef, and, of course, fish, because you can't escape the sea's bounty here. These aren't just meals, they're symbols of prosperity. A successful hunt or bountiful catch isn't just sustenance, it's a status update, a tangible measure of your community's success. And then there's the ale. Brewed from barley, water, and occasionally honey, this isn't your average pint. It's thick, hearty, and potent enough to knock out a berserker. It's also a social lubricant, loosening tongues and fostering camaraderie. Over these mugs of liquid courage, stories are swapped, alliances forged, and occasionally rivalries rekindled. Speaking of stories, this is where Viking gatherings truly shine. Forget the Netflix binge, the sagas are your entertainment, and they come with a live performance element that's hard to beat. The skalds, the poets of your time, are the rock stars of the evening, spinning tales of gods and heroes, of epic battles and tragic love. Their words dance in the flickering firelight, weaving reality and myth into a tapestry as complex as a Norse knot. These sagas are more than just tales, they're the oral archives of your people. They preserve history, albeit with a healthy sprinkle of creative license. After all, who doesn't love a bit of embellishment? The story of a simple skirmish becomes an epic battle involving Odin himself, turning every listener into a believer, if only for a moment. But peel back the layers, and you glimpse the truths at their core, a reflection of societal values, fears, and aspirations. Yet, while these stories soar on the wings of imagination, they also ground you in the stark realities of Viking life. The sagas capture the brutality of your world, the constant threat of war, the capriciousness of the sea, and the harshness of the land. They remind you that while you might share a drink with your chieftain tonight, tomorrow could see you rallying together against a common enemy, whether it be famine, foe, or fate. Now, let's tackle the elephant, or should I say, the dragon. In the room, Hollywood's portrayal of Vikings. Thanks to the magic of cinema, Viking warriors are often depicted as fearsome, horn-helmeted giants, rampaging across the screen in slow-motion glory. But here's the plot twist. Those horned helmets? Pure fiction, dreamt up by 19th-century romanticists who couldn't resist adding a little theatrical flair. The real Viking helmet was a simple iron cap, functional rather than flamboyant. And those raids? Sure, they happened, but they weren't the everyday norm. Viking society was built on the back of farmers and traders, not just warriors. The romantic image of a society constantly at war is as misleading as a compass in the Bermuda Triangle. Most of your days are spent maintaining the homestead, not pillaging distant shores. The reality is more nuanced, a blend of the mundane and the momentous. As a Shieldmaiden, your life straddles this line between myth and reality. The legends paint you as a warrior, fierce and uncompromising, a heroine of the sagas. But the truth is, you're also a farmer, a trader, a member of a community that values cooperation as much as courage. Your shield is both a physical tool and a symbol, representing not just martial prowess, but the responsibility you bear for those around you. In this world, every choice you make, every role you fulfill, adds a thread to the rich tapestry of Viking life. You might train for battle one day, and barter at the market the next. Each action a testament to the multifaceted nature of your existence. The sagas may capture the highlights, the glory, and the gore, but it's in the daily grind that the true legacy of the Shieldmaiden is forged. As the evening wears on and the fire burns low, you find yourself contemplating what it all means. What does it mean to be a Shieldmaiden in a world balanced between harsh reality and legendary adventure? It's a question without a simple answer. Perhaps it's about embracing the complexity of your role, acknowledging that you are both ordinary and extraordinary, timeless and temporary. The legacy of the Vikings lies not just in the sagas or the stones, but in the lives of those who lived, worked, and dreamed in this rugged land. It's a legacy of resilience, of adaptability in the face of an unforgiving world. And as you listen to the final tale of the night, a story of love and loss that echoes the rhythms of your own life, you realize that the true heart of Viking culture beats in the stories you tell and the lives you lead. So, as you lay down to sleep, the warmth of the hearth fading to embers, you carry with you the knowledge that you are part of something far greater than yourself. The sagas may sing of your exploits, but it's the quiet strength and everyday courage that define you. The legacy of the Vikings is not just one of conquest, but of community, of the enduring bonds that tie you to this land and to each other. And as you drift into dreams, the stories of gods and heroes mingling with the call of the sea, you know that tomorrow will bring new challenges and new stories to tell. For now, you rest, a Shieldmaiden in a world where legend and reality dance together in the firelight, leaving behind a legacy as enduring as the stars above. In the bustling marketplace of Athens, 427 BC, where philosophers rubbed shoulders with fishmongers and the air was a soup of ideas and, let's be honest, the occasional whiff of sandal sweat, a young boy named Aristocles was born. Yeah, Aristocles. Plato's real name. What a twist, right? It's like discovering that Madonna's passport says Shikoni. But we'll get to the whole Plato thing in a minute. First, let's set the scene. Athens was the center of the universe for philosophy, democracy, and, occasionally, questionable fashion choices involving togas. It was a city that thrived on debate and discourse, where the currency of the day wasn't just drachmae, but ideas. And smack in the middle of this intellectual whirlwind was young Aristocles, who just so happened to be born into one of those annoyingly influential families. His dad, Ariston, was believed to be descended from the kings of Athens and Messenia, and his mom, Perictione, was related to Solon, the legendary lawmaker. Talk about pedigree. This was the ancient equivalent of having a Kennedy and a Bezos on your family tree. But let's not get too carried away with the glamour of it all. This was also a time when Athens was embroiled in the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, a conflict that was less about glory and more about, well, a 27-year-long disaster. Imagine spending nearly 3 decades fighting over who gets to be the big cheese of the Greek world, only to end up with a lot of broken pottery and wounded pride. It was a classic case of, was it worth it? Spoiler, not really. Amidst all this chaos, young Aristocles had a front-row seat to the circus of Athenian politics and warfare. It's like growing up with CNN on 24/7, but with more chariots and fewer commercial breaks. This environment was a crucible for his developing mind, shaping a philosopher who would one day redefine the very nature of thought. But before he could do that, he had to get a nickname, because Aristocles doesn't exactly roll off the tongue when you're trying to make it big in the philosophy game. Enter the name Plato. Now, there are a few theories about this moniker. Some say it was a nod to his broad shoulders. Platos means broad in Greek. Others suggest it was a wrestling nickname. Yes, our future philosopher was quite the athlete, so think of him as a kind of ancient jock-nerd hybrid. Either way, Plato stuck, and it's a good thing too. The Republic by Aristocles doesn't have quite the same ring to it. By the time Plato was coming into his own, Athens was a city both vibrant and volatile. The intellectual elite would gather at the agora, not just to shop for olives, but to engage in spirited debates about life, the universe, and everything. It was like an ancient TED Talk, but with more shouting and fewer slideshows. And while all this was happening, the war with Sparta dragged on, a grim reminder that even the most enlightened societies can get bogged down in the mire of human conflict. The war was devastating, a relentless drain on resources and morale. The famous plague of Athens in 430 BC, which killed tens of thousands, including the city's great leader Pericles, was a grim reminder of how nature can be an equal opportunity destroyer, regardless of your political aspirations. These events left an indelible mark on the young Plato, teaching him that while ideas are powerful, they are often powerless against the forces of fate and folly. It's in this cauldron of chaos and creativity that Plato began to ponder the big questions. What is justice? What is the ideal state? And crucially, how do you get people to listen to you when they're more interested in who's winning the war than who's winning the argument? His aristocratic heritage gave him access to the best educators of the time, including the legendary Socrates. whose method of questioning everything probably made him great at parties but terrible at small talk. Socrates was a man who could turn a simple "how's the weather?" into a dissertation on the nature of the universe. And to young Plato, he was a revelation. Under Socrates' tutelage, Plato learned not just to question, but to question the questions themselves. It was like philosophy inception, but with less CGI and more sandals. Plato's early life in Athens was a tapestry of contrasts, a city of light and learning overshadowed by the dark cloud of war. It was a place where the ideals of democracy were both celebrated and tested, offering Plato a front-row seat to the theatre of human folly and brilliance. And as he grew from Aristocles into Plato, he carried with him the scars and lessons of a city that was both his crucible and his muse. So there you have it, the early days of Plato, a young man shaped by the echoes of war, the whispers of philosophers, and the weight of a family legacy that was both a gift and a burden. As we move forward, remember this was just the prologue to a philosophical journey that would challenge the very foundations of Western thought. And all because a kid named Aristocles decided to think big and get a catchier name. The journey from Aristocles to Plato wasn't just about a name change and a well-timed teenage epiphany. It was about navigating a world where poetry and philosophy were like oil and water, or maybe more accurately, drachmae and philosophy. In his adolescent years, Plato wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to be the next Homer or the next Socrates. Imagine him as a young poet, quill in hand, trying to craft verses that could make even the muses weep. Yet something was amiss. As he watched the city around him grapple with the existential crises of war and political upheaval, words on a page seemed oddly insufficient. Enter Socrates, Athens resident gadfly, a man who would later be known for his uncanny ability to turn a casual stroll into a philosophical inquisition. Socrates had this knack for asking questions that were as uncomfortable as a toga on a hot day. And let's face it, he could have written the ancient equivalent of How to Win Friends and Influence People, if only he hadn't been so busy, doing the opposite. Socrates didn't just teach Plato to ask questions, he taught him to interrogate reality itself. This was a guy who, if he had access to Twitter, would probably have sparked endless threads debating the nature of justice, with hashtags like "What is truth?" and "Still asking." Plato, inspired and perhaps a little dazzled by Socrates' relentless quest for understanding, made his philosophical U-turn. He shelved the poetry, Homer, and embraced the life of a philosopher. But this wasn't just about swapping sonnets for syllogisms. It was about engaging with the messy, chaotic business of human existence. And nothing exemplified this more than the infamous trial of Socrates in 39 BC, a courtroom drama that would make even modern legal thrillers look like child's play. Now, why was Socrates on trial, you ask? Well, in a city that prided itself on free thought, Socrates had managed to irritate just about everyone by questioning everything. He was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety. In other words, teaching kids to think for themselves and not giving the gods enough Facebook likes. The trial was a spectacle, with Socrates defending himself in his own inimitable style, part cross-examination, part philosophical stand-up routine. Socrates' defense was both brilliant and, in hindsight, rather unwise. When asked what his punishment should be, he suggested free meals for life, courtesy of the state. Cue the collective eye-roll from the Athenian jury, who then sentenced him to death by hemlock. It was a decision that left a significant imprint on Plato, like discovering your favorite band is breaking up right after you've seen them live. For Plato, Socrates' execution was the ultimate WTF moment. It was as if the city of Athens, in a fit of existential pique, had decided to silence its most probing mind. This wasn't just a personal loss, it was a philosophical crisis. Plato saw firsthand how democracy, when wielded unwisely, could become as tyrannical as any despot. It was a reminder that even a society that worshipped wisdom could act with breathtaking folly. Now, let's circle back to Socrates, the man who might just have been the original internet troll. His method, the Socratic method, was essentially a series of questions that peeled back the layers of ignorance like an onion, often leaving everyone in tears. His approach wasn't about offering answers. It was about exposing the shaky foundations of what people believed they knew. To the Athenian elite, he was a pest, poking holes in their certainties. But to Plato, Socrates was a revelation, like finding out your favorite philosopher also moonlights as a comedian. Socrates seemed to relish his role as the intellectual provocateur. He was like that one friend who always plays devil's advocate, but with a purpose. His refusal to accept the status quo, to take anything at face value, was both his charm and his downfall. He taught Plato that real wisdom was about embracing ignorance, knowing that you know nothing and being okay with that, or at least being okay with annoying other people about it. The trial and death of Socrates was a pivot point for Plato, pushing him to question not just the nature of knowledge, but the very fabric of society. How could a city so dedicated to the pursuit of truth be so blind to it? It was a paradox he would chew on for the rest of his life, a riddle wrapped in a toga served with a side of irony. As Plato mulled over these existential conundrums, he began to distance himself from the world of poetry and dive deeper into the philosophical waters. Poetry, with its metaphorical flourishes, suddenly seemed like a distraction from the harsh reality Socrates had laid bare. The time for pretty verses was over. It was now about grappling with the meat and potatoes of human existence, justice, truth, and the ideal state. Plato's adolescent years were thus a cocktail of creativity, rebellion, and existential angst, stirred by the influence of a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. And while Socrates' life ended with a cup of poison, his ideas had already seeped into Plato's mind, fermenting into a vision that would redefine Western thought. As we pause on the brink of Plato's philosophical awakening, remember, this is just the beginning. The world was about to meet a thinker who wouldn't just question reality, but would seek to reshape it. Stay tuned, because the best, or maybe the most perplexing, is yet to come. With Socrates' teachings echoing in his mind, and Athens feeling a bit too hot for comfort, both politically and perhaps literally under that relentless Mediterranean sun, Plato decided to hit the road. But this wasn't your average gap-year backpacking trip. Plato was on a quest for knowledge, scavenging ideas like a philosophical magpie. His journey took him to Italy, Egypt, and then some, plucking the feathers of wisdom wherever he found them. First stop, Italy. Let's clear this up right away. While the idea that Plato met Pythagoras sounds like a philosophical rock concert, it's a myth. Pythagoras had shuffled off this mortal coil around 75 years before Plato even left Athens. But Italy wasn't a bust. Plato hung out with the Pythagoreans, who were still buzzing over the whole numbers, are the secret to the universe thing. Picture a group of bearded thinkers sitting around, possibly wearing robes, discussing how everything boils down to math, which, let's be honest, is a bit like discovering that the meaning of life is algebra. They were the original mathletes, and Plato soaked it all up. The Pythagoreans weren't just number nerds, though. They were also into mysticism, which might explain why Plato's later works had more layers than baklava. But their influence didn't stop at philosophy. They threw in a dash of ethical living and a sprinkle of vegetarianism. That's right, folks. Plato was possibly one of the first philosophers to ponder moral dilemmas over a plate of lentils instead of lamb. After wearing out his sandals in Italy, Plato set his sights on Egypt. Now, Egypt was the ancient world's equivalent of a mystery box. It was the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and a civilization that could make even the Greeks look like late bloomers. Plato was like a kid in a candy store, but instead of sweets, he was gorging on hieroglyphs and esoteric rituals. The Egyptians had a way of combining religion and science that was both mystifying and alluring. They treated mathematics almost like a religion, and their priests were considered the OG intellectuals. Plato must have felt like he'd found a long-lost intellectual cousin. In Egypt, he likely encountered the concept of the immortality of the soul, an idea that would later weave its way into his work like a philosophical golden thread. He marveled at the way the Egyptians kept track of the stars and seasons with a calendar that was more accurate than a Swiss watch. It's no wonder he thought long and hard about the cosmos and how everything fit together. Egypt was the ultimate think tank of the ancient world. But Plato's wanderlust wasn't just about soaking up new ideas. It was also a reaction to the political turmoil back home. Athens was still reeling from the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War and the trial of Socrates. For Plato, hitting the road was about more than just intellectual curiosity. It was a way to escape the Athenian chaos and, perhaps, find a model of governance that didn't end with a philosopher sipping poison. Enter Syracuse, a city on the island of Sicily that was like a Mediterranean soap opera. Here's where Plato's journey takes a bizarre twist, worthy of a Netflix original series. Plato was lured to Syracuse by Dion, the ambitious brother-in-law of the ruling tyrant, Dionysius I, who had visions of a philosopher king. Dion was convinced that Plato could turn his brother-in-law from a despotic ruler into an enlightened monarch. Spoiler, things didn't go as planned. Plato's time in Syracuse was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Dionysius was about as interested in philosophy as a cat is in water. He had a penchant for power and paranoia that made for a volatile mix. Plato found himself caught in a political tug-of-war, with Dion trying to push for reform and Dionysius clinging to his tyrannical ways like a toddler with a favorite toy. In the end, things got hairy. Dionysius, fearing conspiracy and possibly tiring of Plato's lectures on justice and ideal states, decided to detain our philosopher. Yes, Plato, the man who could debate circles around anyone, found himself under house arrest. It was like a bad episode of Locked Up Abroad, only with more togas and fewer orange jumpsuits. Eventually, he was released, but not without a few scars, both literal and metaphorical. This detainment was a harsh wake-up call for Plato. He realized that political vacations could be dangerous, and that not everyone was ready to trade tyranny for philosophy. It was a lesson in the limits of idealism, an experience that would deeply inform his later work, particularly his thoughts on governance and the philosopher king concept. When Plato finally returned to Athens, he was a changed man. The journey had broadened his horizons, filling his head with ideas and his heart with the harsh realities of human nature. He'd seen the power of mathematics and mysticism, the grandeur of Egyptian knowledge, and the pitfalls of political power games. It was a heady cocktail of experience that would fuel his writings for years to come. But this was just the beginning. Plato was about to establish a little institution you might have heard of, the Academy, a place where he could share the wisdom he'd gathered from his travels. The world was about to get a taste of Plato's vision for an ideal society, one seminar at a time. Stay tuned, because the philosophical roller coaster is far from over, and the next stop is the Academy, where students would learn to question everything, just like Socrates taught him. So, back in Athens, with his sandals barely cooled from his Mediterranean escapades, Plato rolled up his philosopher's sleeves and got to work. It was 387 BC, and Athens was still licking its wounds from the Peloponnesian War and the whole "let's kill Socrates" debacle. But Plato had a vision, a place where thinkers could gather, unbound by the chaos of politics, to shape the future with ideas rather than swords. Enter the Academy, Plato's brainchild that was like the first ever intellectual theme park, minus the roller coasters, but with plenty of philosophical rides to blow your mind. Now, before you start imagining marble halls filled with toga-clad scholars, let's ground this in reality. The Academy wasn't some grand, columned edifice, but rather a simple grove of olive trees, a place that could double as a picnic spot for a family reunion. But what it lacked in architectural flair, it made up for in intellectual firepower. Plato's little think tank was located just outside Athens' city walls, a stone's throw from the bustling agora, but far enough to keep out the riffraff and, more importantly, the distractions of city politics. Running. The Academy wasn't a walk in the Athenian park, though. Picture this. Plato had to juggle being an academic dean, a philosophical mentor, and, perhaps most importantly, a fundraiser. Yes, even in ancient times, education came with a price tag. Plato had to keep the drachmae flowing to pay for scrolls, maintain the grounds, and ensure there was enough bread and olives to keep the scholars' stomachs from growling louder than their debates. The cost of running such an operation? Well, let's just say it was enough to make Plato appreciate the Pythagorean's penchant for thrift. And what about the students? They weren't your average toga-wearing bookworms. They were a mix of aristocrats, aspiring politicians, and the occasional wealthy foreigner, all eager to soak up Plato's wisdom. The Academy's curriculum was as diverse as it was rigorous, covering everything from metaphysics to mathematics, and, of course, the ever-controversial topic of governance. Plato was determined to mould minds that could think beyond the immediate and the material. He was crafting the philosopher kings of tomorrow, or at least, that was the plan. You might be wondering, what was the secret sauce that made the Academy tick? It was Plato's unique approach to teaching, which was less about lecturing and more about dialogue, a nod to his old mentor Socrates. This wasn't a place where knowledge was spoon-fed, it was a place where your brain was put through the philosophical ringer. Socratic dialogues were the order of the day, where students and teachers engaged in debates that could stretch for hours, dissecting ideas until they were stripped down to their barest truths. It was like a mental gym, designed to bulk up your wisdom muscles. And speaking of wisdom, let's dive into one of Plato's most famous brainchildren, the allegory of the cave. Imagine this as the ancient world's viral TED Talk, a thought experiment that's inspired thinkers for millennia. In the allegory, Plato asks us to picture prisoners chained inside a cave, only able to see shadows cast on a wall. These shadows, he argues, are the prisoner's reality, distorted and incomplete. But what happens if one prisoner breaks free and steps into the light? He realizes the shadows were mere illusions and that the world is far richer and more complex. It's a metaphor for enlightenment, the journey from ignorance to knowledge, and the philosopher's role in society. But before you get too misty-eyed over the poetic brilliance of it all, let's pause and consider the economic reality. Plato wasn't just spinning allegories for fun. He was subtly critiquing the very society that funded his academy. Athens might have been the cradle of democracy and philosophy, but it was also a place where power and wealth often overshadowed truth. The allegory of the cave was a reminder that most people, content with shadows, resisted the uncomfortable glare of wisdom, a challenge for any philosopher trying to enact real change. And here's the kicker. While Plato was busy teaching others to see beyond the shadows, he was also dealing with the nitty-gritty of running an educational institution. Keeping the academy afloat required not just philosophical brilliance but a savvy head for business. Plato had to ensure that his patrons, those rich benefactors who kept the drachmae coming, were happy and saw value in what he was offering. It was a delicate balance between idealism and pragmatism, a dance with reality that every educator knows all too well. The academy thrived for centuries, a testament to Plato's vision and the enduring power of his ideas. But it wasn't just a hub for philosophical musings. It was a place that influenced politics, science, and art. Its students included some of the brightest minds of the time, such as Aristotle, who would go on to leave his own indelible mark on history. The academy was more than just a school, it was a beacon of intellectual freedom in a world often clouded by the fog of war and dogma. Yet, let's not romanticize it too much. The academy was also a microcosm of its time, a place where privilege often dictated who could partake in its intellectual feast. Despite its lofty ideals, it was still bound by the societal norms and economic structures of ancient Athens. For all its talk of enlightenment, the light of knowledge was still something that only a select few could afford to chase. As we leave Plato in his grove, surrounded by eager students and the occasional curious squirrel, remember that the academy was just one chapter in his philosophical odyssey. The ideas that germinated there would continue to evolve, challenging the very foundations of Western thought. Plato's legacy was like a philosophical relay race, and his baton was about to be passed to the next generation of thinkers. But for now, let's savor the moment, a slice of history where the pursuit of wisdom took center stage and where shadows on a cave wall became a metaphor for the human condition. Stay tuned, because the story of Plato and his philosophical revolution is far from over. As we leave Plato in his grove, surrounded by eager students and the occasional curious squirrel, we turn our gaze to the philosophical ghost of Plato that still haunts the corridors of modern thought. This isn't Casper the Friendly Ghost, more like a spectral presence that drops wisdom bombs through the ages, shaping everything from ethics to epistemology. But what makes Plato's ideas so sticky, like philosophical honey on the collective consciousness? Let's buckle up and sift through his legacy, separating the intellectual gold from the fool's gold. First up, Plato's written works, the dialogues. Think of them as the ancient world's Netflix, except with more toga and fewer dragons. These dialogues, like the Republic, the Symposium, and Phaedrus, were more than just philosophical musings. They were like intellectual soap operas, starring Socrates as the quirky protagonist, asking questions that would make your brain do somersaults. They tackled big themes, justice, love, beauty, and did so with a dramatic flair that would put any Hollywood scriptwriter to shame. But let's not get too starry-eyed. For all their brilliance, Plato's writings were also laden with ideas that make us scratch our heads. Take, for instance, Plato's theory of forms. The idea that every object or concept in the physical world is just an imperfect copy of its ideal form, existing in some ethereal realm. It's like saying your favorite pizza is just a shadow of the perfect pizza that exists on some cosmic menu. While it's an intriguing notion, it's also the kind of stuff that makes you question whether Plato was indulging in more than just philosophical ruminations. Perhaps some ancient Athenian herbs were involved. Then there's the famed Republic, where Plato sketches his vision of an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings. Now, before you start nominating your local philosophy professor for public office, remember that this ideal state had its own quirks. Plato wasn't exactly a champion of democracy. In fact, he viewed it with the same suspicion you'd reserve for a politician promising tax cuts without explaining how. His ideal society was more like an intellectual dictatorship, where the wise few ruled the clueless many. It's a concept that's both fascinating and, let's be honest, a bit terrifying. Despite the contentious nature of some of his ideas, Plato's influence is undeniable. His thoughts on governance and justice have trickled down through the ages, shaping everything from the Enlightenment to modern political theory. But it's not all sunshine and Socratic seminars. Some of Plato's ideas have been co-opted in ways that might make him roll over in his metaphysical grave. Take the notion of the noble lie, a concept that suggests leaders might need to tell fibs for the greater good. It's a slippery slope that's been used to justify everything from propaganda to political spin. And let's not forget the dark side of Platonic thought, the idea that certain people are naturally superior, which has been twisted to prop up elitist ideologies throughout history. It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned ideas can be weaponized in the wrong hands. Plato may have been dreaming of a better world, but human nature has a knack for turning dreams into nightmares. Now, as we fast forward to the present day and ponder what Plato might think of our modern world, it's hard not to imagine him being simultaneously awed and appalled. On one hand, the sheer volume of information available at our fingertips would probably blow his philosophical socks off. On the other, the cacophony of opinions and misinformation might make him long for the relative simplicity of the agora. Would Plato have a Twitter account, you ask? Perhaps, but it's more likely he'd use it to troll politicians with cryptic questions about justice and truth, firing off tweets like, "If democracy is the voice of the people, whose voice do we hear when they're all shouting?" Philosophical burn. In today's world, where technology reigns supreme and the line between reality and illusion blurs with every Instagram filter, Plato's allegory of the cave feels eerily prescient. We still grapple with shadows, only now they flicker on screens rather than cave walls. The challenge remains the same, to step out of the cave and into the light of reason, even if it means confronting uncomfortable truths. Plato's legacy isn't just in the words he wrote or the ideas he championed, it's in the questions he left us to ponder, questions that urge us to seek wisdom in an age drowning in information. As we draw the curtain on Plato's extraordinary journey, let's not forget the economic and social tapestry that shaped his thoughts. From the bustling streets of Athens to the intellectual havens of the Academy, Plato's life was a testament to the power of ideas to transcend time and place. He lived in a world where the cost of knowledge was paid in drachmae and dedication, a world not so different from our own, where education remains a privilege rather than a right. In the end, Plato's legacy is a complex mosaic, one that shines with brilliance but is not without its flaws. He was a man who dared to dream of a world governed by wisdom, even as he navigated the messy realities of human existence. His ideas continue to echo through the ages, challenging us to think deeper, question harder, and strive for a better understanding of ourselves and the world around us. As we bid farewell to Plato, let's carry forward his spirit of inquiry and wonder, remembering that the pursuit of wisdom is a journey without end.